Flirting with the Best Friend, written by Virna DePaul, narrated by Ellen Lang. Prologue. With a last name like O'Rourke, Annie should have felt right at home at Finnegan's pub. Instead, she felt like a kitten trying to keep up with a pride of lions. Perched on the leather seat of her bar stool, she pushed her glasses up higher on her nose, took another sip of her soda, and watched wide-eyed as two extremely attractive firemen bookended her friend Paige at the end of the crowded bar. Paige did not resemble a kitten, more like the queen of the jungle. She was tall and exotic and fond of leather pants, thigh-high boots, and tank tops that showed off her sculpted arms. More importantly, she was an 8th-degree black belt who moved with self-assurance and swagger. Right now, she was wearing a teeny-tiny LBD as she flirted with her two admirers, flipping her hair and throwing out witty banter like a pro. Annie had met her new friend a few months ago after Paige moved to San Francisco from Seattle. She and Annie were both nurses at a local hospital, and they couldn't have been more different. Which is why she's over there basking in male attention and I'm sitting in a corner all by myself, Annie thought. But whatever. When it came to social situations, Annie was accustomed to being the wallflower, but that wasn't who she was in other facets of her life. At work, hanging with her friends, or alone with a man she knew well, she chatted and moved comfortably. It was only when she was around strangers that she mentally morphed into someone else. Someone that acted a lot like her old high school self, the girl with acne, braces, and frizzy hair. Someone who didn't want to be noticed, someone who couldn't wait to be back in the comfort of her own home. Which is where she'd be now if she didn't adore her best friend, Ryan Hennessy, so much. Glancing at her watch, she confirmed the guy was already 30 minutes late for his own going-away party. She'd met Ryan their sophomore year in high school 8 years ago. He'd been popular, already a star player on the football varsity team, and absolutely drool-worthy. Time had only enhanced his appeal. She swore that every time she saw him, he got better looking, yet he was always so wonderfully familiar to her. He and several other firemen, including the two that were talking to Paige, were about to leave for 2 months of extended training in the Northern California redwoods. Ryan was excited about the training he'd receive as a smoke jumper, firefighters who drop from the sky into a fire as the first line of defense. Lately, he'd barely talked about anything else, and as happy as Annie was for him, she was going to miss him like crazy. They usually saw each other a few times a week, just watching movies or cooking dinner for each other. Although that cut back considerably when either of them was dating someone seriously, the way he was now. Annie's heart clenched tightly as she thought of Ryan's newest girlfriend, Samantha Heavensworth. When Ryan wasn't talking about smoke jumping, he was invariably talking about Samantha. Ryan had introduced her to Samantha at the start of the new year, and Annie had immediately noticed how perfect the two of them were together. Of course, Samantha was drop-dead gorgeous. With bright green eyes, a waterfall of golden hair, and an hourglass figure, she resembled a cross between a fairy princess and pole dancer Barbie. But she was also articulate, smart, and kind. The woman was a veterinarian who took care of animals all day long, yet Annie had never once seen her looking less than cover model perfect. Throw in the fact that she could cook like a world-class chef and enjoyed everything outdoorsy like Ryan, and Annie would be surprised if the woman wasn't wearing Ryan's ring by this time next year. Not that he'd indicated he was that serious about Samantha, but Annie had met most of Ryan's girlfriends over the years, and it had become more and more apparent, given the type of woman he gravitated to lately, that Ryan was transitioning from dating in order to have a good time to dating in order to find the woman he could finally settle down with. The thought of Ryan getting married caused her stomach to churn and her throat to close up. Get over it, Annie, so one day soon you'll be demoted to the 4th most important woman in Ryan's life, rather than the 3rd. So what? His mother and sister always deserved top billing, and coming in second to Mrs. Samantha Heavensworth Hennessy wouldn't be so bad. Yeah, right, she mentally groaned. God, it sucked being so sober she couldn't even pull one over on herself. Annie waved at the bartender, an older woman who looked like she'd smoked a serious amount of cigarettes in her lifetime. When the bartender spoke, her hoarse voice only strengthened that impression. "What can I get you, sweetie? Another soda?" "Yes, please," Annie said. The woman handed her a full glass of Sprite, joking, "Not even a little caffeine? Where's the fun in that?" Annie just smiled tightly and the woman left without another word. So she rarely drank alcohol. She didn't enjoy the taste. Or caffeine. It made her feel jittery. Was that so wrong? She supposed it did make her stick out in the crowded bar even more than her long skirt and bulky sweater. But hey, it was a chilly night and she was only here to toast Ryan's trip, not pick anyone up. With a sigh, she took another sip of her drink and scanned the room for Ryan. When she still didn't see him, she pulled out her cell and texted him. "Where are you?" It took a minute, but he texted back. "Just pulled into the parking lot. Sorry we're late." Despite knowing better and despite the fact Ryan would be walking into the bar with oh-so-perfect Samantha, Annie's skin tingled with anticipation at seeing him. He was her best friend, the person she loved spending time with more than anyone in the world. He was beyond handsome, manly, caring, protective, adventurous, funny, sensitive. The list was unending. As Paige would say, he had it going on. Annie continued her wallflower imitation and watched as men and women hooked up all around her. Once or twice she made small talk with the occasional Good Samaritan who recognized her as Ryan's friend and probably felt obliged to check on her. After 10 minutes of that, Annie felt more like beating Ryan on the head than hugging him. Where was he? Hadn't he said he was already in the parking lot? "Hey, I'm sorry about that," Paige said as she slipped onto the bar stool next to Annie. "I didn't mean to leave you sitting here alone so long." "No worries, another 5 minutes though, and I would have gone to save you. You look like you were having such a horrible time talking to those gorgeous firefighters," she joked. Paige laughed. "Yeah, it was absolute torture. Those guys don't know what hit them. They can't stop staring at you." Paige fanned herself. Really? They were both really hot. When the bartender set a pretty drink in front of her, Paige took a long swallow, then stared at her drink intently, as if lost in thought. "Everything okay?" Annie asked. "I didn't say anything wrong, did I?" Paige shook her head, then leaned in close to Annie. "No, I was just reminded of something." She hesitated, biting her lip, then took a deep breath and continued. "Don't tell anyone, but sometimes I'm overwhelmed by all the male attention I've been getting. It wasn't always that way, and my ex was the king at making me feel inferior. I can't believe I was so madly in love with the guy." Annie's eyes widened with surprise. Although she'd known Paige was divorced, her friend hadn't talked about that time in her life. And to hear that her confident friend had ever felt inferior was shocking. "Did he ever—" Annie's voice trailed off. Paige shook her head. "No physical abuse. But I was so in love, I would have done anything to be with him. That included sacrificing my self-esteem." "I have a hard time picturing you like that," Annie said. Her friend's self-esteem seemed off the charts now. As for Annie's, Annie liked who she was for the most part, but she knew her social anxiety had a lot to do with her own insecurities. No matter how many times her friends told her otherwise, she still felt too plain and pudgy to be truly comfortable in her own skin. And as far as doing anything to keep a man, Annie knew a ton about that. She'd been lying to the world for the past 8 years, pretending to only feel friendship for Ryan when she was madly in love with the guy. Heck, at his urging, she'd even promised him 8 years ago that she'd never jeopardize their friendship by trying to hook up with him. She still had pangs of regret about making that vow. Sometimes she wondered what might have happened if she had admitted her feelings for him. "So how'd you get over your ex when you were that in love?" She scooted forward on her stool, holding her breath as if Paige's advice could work miracles. "You obviously have your self-esteem back too. What's your secret?" "He cheated on me yet again and something inside me just snapped. I decided I wasn't going to spend one more day crying over him." Paige fiddled with her glass and her gaze looked far away as if she were looking back into her past. "So I transformed myself." Annie's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Paige sipped her Cosmo. I became the kind of woman that doesn't pine for any man. I envisioned myself as confident, sexy, strong. The type of woman who was willing to take risks and explore new horizons. She made it sound so easy. Is that when you got a black belt in karate? No, I'd been working on that for years. Paige shook her head, then squinted as if in thought. But I changed other things. I improved how I dressed, the way I walked. I finally quit the job that was boring me to death and made use of the nursing degree I'd gotten before I met my husband. She lifted her glass in a toast, then emptied the remaining contents. And you really got over him? Someone you loved that much? Transforming myself didn't just get me over him. It jump-started a life I'd always wanted to lead. It led me to being my best self. That sounds awesome, Paige, Annie said, looking at her friend admiringly. If only she had the guts to do something like that, to transform herself. It feels awesome, too. Paige turned on her seat to scan the bar. So where the heck is your friend Ryan? You said you wanted to leave by 8 because you have an early shift tomorrow, and it's getting close to that time now. Shoot, Annie said and checked her watch. He texted that he and his girlfriend were here about 15 minutes ago. Let me go check where he is. She got off her bar stool and had taken 2 steps when she was stopped by Paige's hand on her shoulder. Annie, you sure you want to? She turned to face her friend. What's that? Paige sighed. Nothing, sweetie. I'll wait for you here. Okay, be right back. Annie made her way through the crowd and opened the front door. She took a few steps toward the illuminated parking lot, immediately spotting Ryan's black pickup. She couldn't imagine what was keeping Ryan and Samantha, but she froze when she saw them. Ryan's muscular body pressed Samantha's smaller frame against the side of his truck. Her fingers were tangled in his hair while Ryan's held her tight against him. They were kissing madly. They both groaned with pleasure. Annie felt like she'd been kicked in the stomach. Not once, not ever, had she seen Ryan full-on making out with a woman. She wasn't stupid. She knew Ryan had been with plenty of women. But seeing it was different, made it more real, more devastating. And if she could see them... Quickly, Annie backed away, almost tripping over her own feet in her haste to get back inside. The last thing she wanted was for Ryan to spot her. The horror she felt had to be written all over her face. One look at her and he'd know how devastated she felt, how hurt, how destroyed. He'd know that she was in love with him, and then their friendship would change forever. Things could get to the point where he wouldn't even want to be around her anymore. She couldn't let that happen. Fighting to catch her breath and hold back her tears, Annie stormed to the back of the bar where the restrooms were located. Before she stepped inside, she caught Paige's gaze and called out, "Be right back, then we can go." Paige looked worried about her, but Annie couldn't deal with that right now. She flew into the bathroom, locked herself into a stall, covered her face with her hands, and struggled to hold back her sobs. No such luck. The sobs racked through her uncontrollably. The pain she was feeling had reached agonizing new heights. Ryan was her best friend, and she'd never want to lose him, but something needed to change. It took her about 5 minutes to calm down enough to breathe normally. After splashing water on her face, she stared at herself in the mirror. She didn't like what she saw. A chubby woman with glasses and mousy brown hair, her eyes red and puffy. She was a pathetic woman, pining for a guy who would never want her the way she wanted him. In that moment, she hated who she was. She remembered what Paige had said when Annie had asked how she'd gotten her self-esteem back and gotten over her ex. I transformed myself into the kind of woman that didn't pine for any man. I envisioned myself as confident, sexy, strong, the type of woman that was willing to take risks and explore new horizons. If Paige could do it, then so could Annie. She was done being the nice girl. She was ready to take some risks. Looking at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she vowed that by the time Ryan came back from training in 2 months, she would be a new woman. She'd be over him, and she'd finally be ready to move on with her life. Chapter 1. "Here you go," the clerk said. The young woman had dyed red hair, piercings, and visible tattoos that contrasted with her vintage baby doll dress. She easily emanated the hipster, I'm not really trying vibe that ran rampant in San Francisco's Mission District. She handed Annie a discreet white-handled bag. The upcoming weekend in Vegas was supposed to be all about having fun. Specifically, it was Annie's opportunity to stretch her bad girl muscles and complete her carefully planned list. So why did thinking about it make her want to throw up? Because you're set in your boring nice girl ways, Annie. That's the point. You need to go against your instincts and be the bad girl for once. Bad girls have more fun. The stronger part of her personality, her inner nice girl, wasn't convinced. She'd spent the last 2 months transforming herself, not by being bad, exactly, but by doing things she normally wouldn't, like getting LASIK surgery so she could ditch her glasses, highlighting her mousy brown hair, and starting to take diet pills when her slow and steady weight loss regimen had hit a wall. Now her eyesight was perfect, her hair looked awesome, and she'd lost over 20 pounds. Unfortunately, she was still in love with Ryan as much as ever, and she'd barely even seen the guy. That's why she'd made her list. It was time for drastic measures. Annie took the bag from the clerk and said, "Thanks, Sweet Sensations" was packed with men and women, both young and old. Trying to appear nonchalant, she walked over to Paige. Despite her embarrassment, she was proud she'd ventured into the store and made her purchase. Now she just had to get home, wrap it, and stick it under her Christmas tree before Ryan came over. At the thought of Ryan's broad shoulders soon filling up space in her little apartment, her pulse quickened. It had been only a week since she'd accompanied him to his college buddy Eric's wedding in Coronado Island. However, the weekend had been tense between them, and not just because the groom had jilted the bride. No, the awkwardness had started well before that, when Ryan picked her up in the San Diego airport to take her to the wedding. She hadn't seen him in over 2 months, and she'd been imagining the feel of his arms around her when he scooped her in for one of his hugs. Couldn't wait to inhale his clean, woodsy scent. Only when he'd seen her, Ryan hadn't hugged her. At least not right away. Instead, clearly shocked by her dramatic weight loss, he'd implied she looked unhealthy. Granted, she'd lost over 20 pounds in the 2 months he'd been away, and despite their frequent calls, texts, and emails, she'd managed to keep the secret from him. So, okay, seeing the improved her, complete with new hairstyle and wardrobe, had to have been shocking. But damn it, she'd transformed herself into someone more like the women he'd dated, and all he'd done was criticize her. He'd hurt her feelings, whether he'd meant to or not, and she'd withdrawn into herself, something she hadn't done with Ryan before. Eventually, she'd moved past it. It had been hard to stay mad given the way Brienne, the jilted bride, had insisted on going forward with the wedding reception and had personally urged Ryan and Annie to hit the dance floor. Whether he'd been boogieing with her or holding her close for a slow song, dancing with Ryan was the most fun she'd had in a long time. Over the past week, he'd called her almost every day, and while that wasn't unusual in and of itself, there was a new hesitancy in his voice each time their conversations began. Hopefully, after they had dinner tonight, things would be back to normal between them. She was going to have a very busy and adventurous weekend, one that would require tremendous focus. She wasn't a fool either. She was going to be bad, but she was going to exercise caution, too. She didn't want to have to worry about her relationship with Ryan at the same time. "Ready?" Paige asked as she walked up to her, her own white-handled bag in hand. She flashed Paige a bright smile. "Definitely," she said, her voice strained. Paige patted her on the shoulder and laughed. "You did good for your first time. Next time will be easier." Next time? Yikes, she still hadn't recovered from this time. As they walked outside toward Annie's car, Paige handed her the bag. "Merry Christmas, Annie. I'm sure you'll enjoy it when the time is right." "Thanks, Paige." Annie had already given Paige her gift earlier. "And thanks for coming with me today. It was an experience." Paige laughed. "Nothing like what you're going to experience in Vegas. I want a full report, including how Ryan reacts. He's my friend. As long as I'm happy, he'll be happy." She tried to inject a note of confidence in her voice she wasn't feeling. Paige knew her well enough to know her statement wasn't completely true. "Oh, is that why you're not telling him your plans before you go?" Annie bit her lip. "I just don't want him to worry." Or try to stop her. Which he inevitably would, the way any sane man who thought of her as a little sister would try to stop her. He wouldn't worry if he was the one you were flexing your bad girl muscles at instead of a stranger. Never going to happen. Ryan had relegated her to the friend zone years ago. She remembered the exact day he'd made it crystal clear he'd never be interested in her as more than a friend. She'd gone over to his house to help him study for finals their junior year. Somehow they'd started talking about how Suzanne Miller and Peter Horace, two former best friends, had hooked up and then broken up, resulting in them hating each other throughout most of high school. Ryan had turned to her, ruffled her hair, and said, "Let's promise each other here and now, Annie, that we'll never hook up and risk our friendship." Somehow, despite feeling like he'd ripped her heart right out of her chest, she'd smiled weakly and given him the promise he'd wanted. One he'd repeated back to her. "Are you sure you want to do this, Annie?" Paige said, jolting her out of her thoughts. "Maybe you should wait until I can go with you. It's not the safest thing, a woman going to Vegas by herself." "You've done it," she pointed out. "You transformed yourself into a confident woman who could do it. And that's what I'm going to do. I can do this, Paige." Paige looked torn for a second before nodding. "I know you can." She blew out a breath and gave Annie a hug. "Tell Ryan I said hi." "I will." As Annie drove away, she tried not to dwell on how awkward things had been between her and Ryan last week, or how guilty she felt that she wasn't telling him her plans. Instead, she focused on how much she was looking forward to seeing him and how even more awesome things would be after Vegas. She'd be that much closer to proving she could be the Annie she needed to be. Confident, sexy, independent, and no longer in love with her best friend. At her front door, Annie dropped her groceries and the bag containing her secret present when she fumbled in her purse for her apartment keys. After leaving Paige, she'd headed to the local farmer's market and picked up stuff for dinner with Ryan. Cooking for Ryan was easy. He had 5 main dishes he liked, and she knew how to make each of them. But before she got down to preparing the chicken piccata she planned to serve tonight, she had business to do, namely pack for her Vegas trip. Finally finding her key, she opened the door to her apartment and stood for a moment in the doorway, taking in the sights of Christmas. In the corner of her living room, she had an artificial Christmas tree, completely decorated with lights, tinsel, and colorful glass ornaments. On the mantel over the fireplace was a beautiful swag of pine boughs with red holly berries. And on the coffee table sat a lovely creche. Christmas in June. She'd had the decorations up all week, and tonight, with Ryan, would be the final celebration. Most people thought she was nuts, but this was her one way of connecting with her mother. Losing her when Annie was in high school had been devastating, but Annie had refused then, and still refused to let the grief overwhelm her and dictate her life. Instead, she chose to celebrate her mother's joy and verve for life on a daily basis. Christmas had been her mother's favorite holiday, and when they'd realized her mother wouldn't make it to the 4th of July, they had decided to celebrate in June. Annie had continued the tradition. God, she missed her mom. Annie suspected her mom wouldn't have been too happy about Annie's naughty list, but eventually she'd have told Annie she trusted her and to do what she needed to do. That's what she'd told Annie when she'd given her the talk before she died. She'd also told Annie, a girl who knows her own heart is a girl who'll grow to be a happy woman. For too long, she'd focused on her one-sided feelings for Ryan, so it was no wonder she'd never had a successful long-term relationship with another man. It was time for her to listen to what her heart was telling her right now. It was time to move on. She quickly put the groceries away in the kitchen, then dashed into her bedroom where she packed for Vegas. Not knowing what she would need when she arrived in Sin City, she threw everything she could think of into a large rolling case and smaller carry-on. Excited, she tossed in some new lingerie. She went to her closet to grab more clothes, only to trip over one of the many cardboard boxes stuffed inside the closet. Boxes that contained memorabilia and pictures from her younger years. This was a fresh start for her, and she didn't want to be constantly reminded of the chubby, unhappy woman she'd been, the kind of woman who pined away for a man she could never have. After heading back into the living room, she took a moment to stare at the Christmas tree. Sitting back on her heels, she pressed her palms together and breathed out deeply. Anxiety filled her body, but determination pushed its way through. "Vegas, baby," she murmured to herself. Yeah, her plan was a little crazy, especially for a nice girl like her, but she needed to do this. It was time to move on to a bolder, more satisfying life, and Vegas was her key. Chapter 2. Ryan Hennessy knocked on Annie's door. When she didn't answer right away, he used his key and stepped inside. He immediately felt transported to another place, Annie's place, where most days it smelled fresh and lemony, but right now it smelled like cinnamon and pine. Christmas music played softly and lights twinkled on the Christmas tree. It wasn't Christmas. It wouldn't be Christmas for another 6 months. But ever since he'd known her, Annie celebrated Christmas in June. While Jean Marie Christmas, so named after Annie's mother, could have been bittersweet, it was almost always a time of joy, and Annie's family and closest friends got into the spirit with her. Only he, however, had ever been granted the privilege of spending the final evening with her. "Babe, are you there?" he called out just as he registered the sound of running water. "I'm... shower. Come on in." As always, the sound of her voice made him smile. Hell, just walking into her place eased the pressure in his chest and relaxed his tight muscles. No matter how stressful a day he had, he could always count on his best friend to make him feel better. That's why spending 2 months away from her while he'd fought forest fires in the Northern California redwoods had been a mixed blessing. He'd loved the work, especially the 4 weeks he'd spent working with smoke jumpers. He'd never felt his adrenaline pump so hard. Had loved the thrill of flying into a desolate wilderness area, jumping out of a plane, picking up an axe, and conducting the initial mode of attack. It was brutal and exhilarating and oddly comforting because it also gave him a break from the personal tragedies he often witnessed when fighting urban fires. All that had been tainted because he'd missed Annie. The muscles that had relaxed upon walking into her apartment tightened again, and his stomach twisted into knots. He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped on the text he'd received hours earlier. Before he'd gotten it, he would have sworn he'd never leave San Francisco, mainly because Annie was here. But now Ryan was being offered a spot as a smoke jumper on the very team he'd trained with. The team leader would be in San Fran on other business next week and wanted to meet with Ryan to talk about it. Just a formality, he said, because given what he'd seen when Ryan worked with him, the job was Ryan's if he wanted it. He did want it. In order to have it, however, he'd have to give up things that mattered to him, including living close to Annie and seeing her whenever he wanted. Cursing softly, he walked over to the cheerfully decorated Christmas tree in the corner of her living room. He tucked his gift beneath it, right next to the one labeled "To Annie, from Annie." He needed to get a few more things for her. Maybe a pretty sweater with a lower collar than she normally wore, one that would show off the necklace he'd already gotten her. "Hey Annie, mind if I grab a beer?" he called, even though she probably wouldn't be able to hear him with the water still going. But it wasn't like he actually needed her permission. They were comfortable in each other's homes. She was the first person he'd wanted to talk to after getting the text offering him the smoke jumper job. He knew she'd want the best for him and that she'd reassure him nothing would change between them, but he wanted to be looking into her eyes when she did. As he walked into the kitchen, he could smell dinner warming in the oven. Opening the refrigerator, he pulled out one of the bottles of beer she always kept on hand for when he came over. He popped off the cap and took a long swig. Then he stared at the front of the fridge, frowning. It used to be covered with pictures of the two of them, including one of his favorites taken while they'd been hiking in Yosemite last year. The photo was gone. There were still photos of Annie's family and other friends, but the only picture that had Annie or Ryan in it was the one of them dancing at what would have been his friend Eric's wedding last week. Even with Eric a no-show, his fiancée Brianne had gone forward with the reception. In the picture, Annie was in Ryan's arms, but he could see how awkward things had been between them that day. Why had she taken the other photos of him down? Why was the only photo she'd left of herself one that showed her after she'd lost weight? He still wasn't used to seeing Annie so skinny. As gorgeous as Annie looked in the photo, she didn't look like herself. He was actually bracing himself for how he'd feel when she walked in the room. And he couldn't help feeling that anxiety in his chest again that his best girl was slipping away from him. If he took the smoke jumper job, they'd be even further apart. He traced his finger across her face in the photo and managed to knock it to the floor along with several others. Cursing, he placed his beer on the counter and then crouched down. He picked up the photos and began sticking them back where they belonged, only he'd managed to knock over more than just photos. He stared at an airline boarding pass, frowning when he saw the departure date, tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. He frowned even harder when he saw the destination. Las Vegas. Annie was flying to Vegas? Since when? And why hadn't she told him? He'd been in Vegas a week ago for Eric's bachelor party just before he'd picked up Annie at the airport for Eric's wedding. The bachelor party had been a wild nightclub scene and she'd never been comfortable clubbing. Her friend Paige, sure, but not Annie. She was probably going to catch a show or go to a scrapbook convention. Maybe her job has sent her to Vegas for some reason. Unless she'd met a guy while he'd been away and this trip was a date. If so, why not tell him she was dating? Even if she wasn't, why hadn't she mentioned her Vegas trip? He frowned, thinking once again of Eric's wedding. Or rather, what should have been Eric's wedding. All through the reception and afterwards, he and his other college buddies had tried to get a hold of Eric, but he'd dodged their calls. He was still dodging them. It was obvious at the reception that Annie had been pissed at him for his comments about her sudden weight loss. He'd just been so worried about her. Thankfully, she'd softened as the night went on. Everything had seemed to return to normal between them once they'd arrived back in San Francisco, but now, staring at the airline ticket, he was struck by the awful feeling that something had changed that day and he just hadn't known it. It was like Eric all over again. Ryan was being shut out and he didn't know why. When you were friends with someone, good friends, you shared your life with them. Not every single detail, of course, but certainly something as important as canceling a wedding or taking an unusual trip to Vegas. Ryan grabbed his beer and was returning to the living room when another piece of paper on the floor caught his eye. He must have knocked it off the refrigerator. He picked it up, glanced at it, and how to be naughty in Vegas. Annie tossed the towel in the hamper and reached for her baggy sweats and t-shirt, what she usually wore at home, even when Ryan was over, then stopped. No way. Not anymore. Not after stepping on the scale this morning and discovering she'd hit her target weight. No more hiding behind comfy clothes. A confident woman wasn't afraid to show off her curves. She whirled around and headed to her closet, where she dug around until she found the skinny jeans with the tag still hanging off the butt. She bought them a couple of weeks ago, challenging herself to push harder during her exercise classes and lose the last bit of excess weight her body had been clinging to. And she had. She slipped the jeans on but had to lie on her bed to zip them up. A target weight was just that, a target. She'd hit it. Now she needed to make another target goal, another 5 pounds, 7. She stood, slid a tight-fitting stretch tee on, then finished her hair and makeup before examining herself in the mirror. Now that her face was leaner, she looked less like a college kid and more like a fashionable woman. Her blonde highlights really brought out the blue of her eyes. At certain angles, however, her face looked a little drawn, severe. She bit her lip, remembering how often Ryan had said he loved her softness and curves. Maybe she wouldn't try to lose another 5 pounds after all. She was sick to death of watching what she ate anyway. Sometimes she just wanted to enjoy a cookie or a piece of pizza without feeling guilty. But no, she couldn't give in to those cravings or it would be all downhill from there. That's what the diet pills were for, to give her that extra edge of willpower. Although she hated how jittery they sometimes made her feel, it was worth it. Every time she was out now, men cast appreciative glances her way. To herself, she might look a little severe, but it was a look men obviously liked. Deciding she appeared like a sexy, confident woman on the outside, she went out to see Ryan and check on dinner. Annie padded barefoot into the living room, only to find it empty. "Ryan?" He appeared in the kitchen doorway and raised a bottle in his hand. "I got a beer. Hope you don't mind." "Of course not," she said, walking over to give him a hug. It seemed like he hesitated for a minute, but then his big arms enfolded her in a way that never failed to make her feel safe. Immediately, she pictured him in the parking lot with Samantha. No, she shuddered, trying to get that awful image out of her mind. "No, I shouldn't have grabbed a beer. You got them for me, right?" "No, I mean, yes, of course you should have gotten the beer, but I got them for both of us." She almost burst out laughing at the shocked look on Ryan's face. "Since when do you drink beer?" "Since right now," she said with a smile. "Okay," he said, his expression still confused. He took another sip of his drink. She gave herself a minute to take him in. Ryan was the epitome of big and buff. Just over 6 feet, broad and muscular all over. He had thick wrists and thighs and hands that were massive yet strangely elegant. His dark brown hair was streaked with lighter strands, the texture full and slightly shaggy. His strong jaw had a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, and his gray-green eyes turned dark and penetrating depending on how he was feeling. She'd seen him stripped down to shorts often enough to know that the hard planes and bulging muscles hinted at beneath his clothes more than lived up to their promise. The guy had the type of six-pack a girl could bounce quarters off of, and Annie had seen women literally swoon as they'd watched Ryan pull himself out of the pool. Who could blame them, with all those rivulets of moisture slowly winding their way down his throat and chest? Mentally, Annie had been right there with him, lapping up all that water like a madwoman. To Annie, Ryan was the sexiest man on the planet, the perfect combination of manly strength and all-American quarterback charm. But his personality and his heart were just as amazing. She realized she was staring at him, then realized he was staring at her. "So," she began. "So, you really like beer now?" he asked. She shrugged. "I've loosened up since you've been gone." Feeling like she needed to prove it, she held her hand out for a drink of his beer. Slowly, he handed it to her. She took a sip, thinking a delighted, "My mouth is right where his was," and barely stopping herself from crinkling her nose. She'd ordered more drinks in the past 2 months and discovered she liked champagne, red wine, and the occasional cocktail. She was still acquiring a taste for beer, but he didn't need to know that. She lowered the bottle, handed it back to him, and forced the corners of her mouth upward. "Just what I needed, though the downside to drinking now is the extra calories." He stared at her intently, and she braced herself, waiting for him to make yet another comment about her weight. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "You look great, Annie. Beautiful as always." "Thanks." No criticism there, yet he'd still managed to communicate that he'd found her beautiful even before she lost weight. But she knew perfectly well the way she looked now was far more in line with what society and Ryan himself considered truly beautiful. But who knew? She'd never thought she'd consider breast augmentation, but lately the idea had been holding greater appeal. Just one more step in her transformation. Ryan glanced into the kitchen and frowned. And that's when she remembered the list on her refrigerator. But it had been hidden beneath some other papers and photos. He couldn't have seen it. Is something wrong?" she asked, immediately straining to see past him to the refrigerator door, but everything looked as it should, and she didn't see any sign of the printed boarding pass or the list that had been tucked behind it. "Nope, nothing's wrong. I just had a rough day." Annie immediately returned her attention back to him. Ryan was a firefighter and liked his job, but sometimes it took its toll. Grabbing his hand, she pulled him over to the couch. "Sit down and tell me about it." He sat and said, "It's just been a really bad week overall, and a surprising one." "I'm sure, starting with the wedding. Have you been able to get in touch with Eric?" "He replied to our initial calls via email, telling us he was okay and would explain things eventually, but that's it."
Just enough so we'd stop considering foul play.
But he's a businessman, right? There's no reason anyone would want to hurt him.
Not that I know of, but the guy's obviously got secrets. Secrets he's not willing to share with his friends.
Not yet, anyway, she said softly. She stared at him, and it was right there on the tip of her tongue to tell him about her decision to go to Vegas, about her resolution to transform herself into a bolder, more interesting and confident Annie. But heck, why stop there? She was afraid if she started talking, she'd blurt out the full truth. How much she loved him, how much she wanted him. Not gonna happen. So you said it's been a bad week. At work, too? He nodded. What's going on? He swiped a hand over his face.
It's just different now that I'm back.
You mean after working up north?
Yeah, I miss the wide open spaces.
Do you ever think about moving up there permanently? He hesitated briefly before saying,
I've considered it, but there's stuff I'd miss here, too. You, the guys at the station, the bay, the nightlife.
He shrugged.
Everything's a compromise, a risk. Can't go for something new without giving up what you already have, you know?
She frowned. Was that really true? Living was all about pursuing growth, change. But that didn't mean you had to give up what was really important to you as it happened. Of course, as much as she wanted him to be fulfilled in his job, she'd miss him like crazy if he moved. Sometimes she wondered if Ryan would ever be completely fulfilled at work. He'd done a lot of different things. Before he was a firefighter, he'd been a personal trainer, and before that, a bartender. But he always seemed to get antsy around the 2-year mark. He couldn't seem to commit to a career any more than he could commit to a woman.
Anyway, well, you know old Bobby finally retired. I'm happy for him. He and his wife are moving to Florida, and he's going to buy a fishing boat.
But, Annie prompted,
this kid who replaced him is going to kill me, maybe literally.
So he's making an already dangerous job even more dangerous?
David's just so damned cocky. He thinks he already knows everything, and he really doesn't know shit. He's been on 2 fire calls with us. During the first, he froze up, and I physically had to move him out of the way. Fine. Then we go to this second one.
It was a bad one? She asked. She could see it in his eyes. There was pain there, which made her suspect someone must have died. He grimaced and dragged his hand through his hair.
Children were involved. Their mother got drunk and fell asleep with a cigarette. We got them all out alive, but a couple of the kids were severely injured. So David starts mouthing off about how if we'd gotten there 2 minutes sooner, we could have really saved them. Truckee, the firefighter in the driver's seat, got pissed. He took it as a personal affront since. He went after David. I got between them because I didn't want to see Truckee get in trouble, but now he's pissed at me too. He thinks I was taking the kid's side.
Did you talk to Truckee? She asked. She rubbed his tense shoulders as he talked.
I tried. He's too pissed to hear it right now. One of the neighbors heard David, and the drunken mother started mouthing off about it, and now there's an investigation. It's all a bunch of bullshit. We did our best. We always do.
If you guys hadn't gotten there when you did, those kids would be dead. And Truckee's been doing this a long time. The job hasn't broken him yet, and it won't break him now. He sighed.
Everything always looks better through your eyes. Let's change the subject, though.
He reached one of his strong arms around her and pulled her into him. She went willingly, relishing the tingles of pleasure that zipped up her spine. But she didn't relish the familiar feeling of longing that flooded her. I still want him, she thought, and abruptly pulled away. Ryan frowned.
What's wrong?
She shook her head. Nothing. So, what else do you want to talk about? He hesitated briefly before saying,
Tell me what's been going on with you. Anything exciting?
Was it just her imagination, or was he staring at her a little more intently? Things have been very exciting, she said. He seemed to relax slightly. Weird. She opened her mouth to ask what was up, but before she could, he said,
Tell me.
She shrugged. Well, if you think life in a fire station is tough, you should try a shift at the long-term care unit. Weirdly, something like disappointment flashed across his face. But it was gone so fast, she told herself she must have imagined it.
Long-term care? How'd you end up there?
Being too nice, as usual, she said. 2 people called in sick and we had an extra nurse. They asked for a volunteer and guess whose hand went up? He laughed.
You are kind of a sucker sometimes.
You think? So I get over there, and of course the first thing I do is make the rounds and meet my patients, who, by the way, I had 16 of. I met 2 of the sweetest little old ladies you've ever seen in the first room. In the second room, there were 2 older men playing checkers. I thought that was so cute, right up until one of them, the one in a wheelchair, grabbed a handful of my ass. Ryan immediately frowned.
Did you report them?
No, he was harmless.
How old was he?
Ryan asked. 94, she said. It's a miracle he can remember what it is and where it's at. He crossed his arms over his chest.
Still, I don't like it. You deserve to be treated with respect.
She patted his arm. Thanks, but calm down, Superman. It wasn't a big deal. Anyway, once I disengaged my ass from his old claw, I moved farther into the room. It was filthy, and there were things stacked everywhere. I couldn't even imagine how a guy in a wheelchair maneuvered around all his stuff. It was a fire hazard, I'm telling you. Anyways, I sent 2 of my CNAs to clean it up while I prepared the guy's feeding tube. I had everything hooked up and I was ready to start the machine when Mr. Grabbed My Ass suddenly rolled up behind me. The guy goosed me. I jumped, and since I had my hand on the knob, the machine came on. It wouldn't have been a big deal, but the clipboard I had in my hand somehow got caught on the tubing and pulled it loose. I didn't realize that as I turned, but the tube feeding was pooling around my feet.
Oh no,
he said, trying very hard not to look amused. Oh no is right. The old guy tried to roll away, and I took 1 step in his direction. Both of my feet went out from under me, and within seconds I was sitting in a creamy, nutritious pool of Ensure. Ryan laughed. Annie pretended to be annoyed with him, but in truth it had been what she was going for. She loved it when he was happy, and she loved it even more when she was the one who made him that way. She'd fall on her ass any day just to see him smile.
Thank you,
he told her when he finally stopped laughing.
I needed that.
I live to serve, she said with a smile and a bow of her head.
Did you hurt yourself when you fell?
Nope, she swatted her hip. Still plenty of padding left to cushion my fall. His gaze dropped to her lower half and his hand twitched, as if it was imagining touching her. She licked her lips and leaned slightly closer to him. He blinked and suddenly his expression went blank. He reached out and held her hand between his.
So, nothing else going on? How are you, really?
Annie wanted to snatch her hand away and slap him. God, the way he'd looked at her, she would have sworn. But no, her mistake, again. She forced herself to say, I'm good, Ryan. He didn't seem to believe her. What? He cleared his throat.
Nothing. Have you been thinking of your mom?
Ah, so that's what was going on. I miss her, she admitted. Of course she did. She missed her mom so much, but the reason she continued celebrating Jean Marie Christmas was so she could focus on all the wonderful moments she'd had with her, not the sad times. Ryan knew that, but he always checked in to make sure she was okay. I talked to Dad and Janie. Janie was Annie's sister who'd followed in Annie's wake and celebrated Jean Marie Christmas too. Usually they celebrated together, but her sister had moved to Chicago a couple of years back, and it was harder for them to get together. They're good.
I'm glad.
Releasing her hand, he leaned back on the couch, arms spread on the back.
So, I know we normally wait until after dinner to exchange gifts, but I thought we could get to the gifts early this year.
Looking toward the Christmas tree, Annie immediately spotted the new gift nestled next to the box that contained the special toy. Despite herself, she blushed, but covered it by jumping up. Oh, goody! I'll grab yours, you grab mine, and let's meet back here. As if the 5 feet back to the couch would be some significant journey. But he just stood and then joined her again on the couch with the gift. You first, she said. He ripped through the wrapping and opened the box. As he lifted the gift from the paper, she watched his face anxiously. He wasn't smiling anymore, and as he pushed the button on the front of the frame and stared at the screen, she winced, wondering if she'd made a mistake. She'd gotten him a digital album and loaded it with pictures. There were several of them, and she'd forced herself to include the ones taken before she lost weight because she wouldn't have been in the album otherwise. There were also pictures of his family, his friends, and his dog, Butter, who'd passed away suddenly just before Ryan had left for Northern California. He'd loved that dog, and so had Annie. He'd had him since he was 16 years old, but maybe it was too soon. He laid a hand over his heart.
I love it, Annie. Thank you.
He reached out and hugged her. I'm glad you like it.
Now you,
he finally said. Flustered, she snatched up his gift. She opened it with far more care than he'd shown. Ryan was great at gift-giving, and he had exquisite taste. She could tell from the packaging that he'd gotten her another piece of jewelry, which was awesome, considering she never bought jewelry for herself. The earrings she wore almost every day were from him, and so was her watch. She lifted the lid to the box and gasped. It was a necklace with a dainty diamond heart. She touched it and whispered, "It's beautiful." She threw her arms around him, hugging him tight, letting go of the restraint she'd been forcing herself to exercise.
Not as beautiful as you, he said.
Closing her eyes, she relished his words and his closeness. When he moved to pull away from her, however, she found herself hanging on. She squeezed his arms so hard her nails pinched his skin and he gasped. Swiftly, she let go and pulled back. His gaze met hers, hot, intense. His gaze flickered to her mouth. Time stopped. The air around them quivered, shimmered. Her pulse accelerated. Her breathing grew ragged. God, he looked like he wanted to kiss her. Not as a friend, but as a lover. But that didn't surprise her as much as what he did next. He leaned in and actually did it. He kissed her. It wasn't the peck on the lips he often gave her, nor was it a full-on open-mouthed kiss with tongue. It was somewhere in between. It was a gentle graze. It was a quick flick. It was a hint of teeth and pressure that increased slightly, then slightly more, before vanishing. It was both sweet and hot. It left her confused. And when he pulled away, it left her wanting more. Much, much more. Ryan felt like he'd been sucker-punched multiple times. Mother of God, he'd kissed Annie. And not the chaste way he usually did, but with heat, passion, and with the intense desire to pull her deeper, kiss her harder. The feel of her mouth had been incredible. He knew what her lips felt like. He'd given her sedate kisses over the years. The first time was in college, when he hadn't seen her for a while, and was so excited when she showed up at his dorm on a prearranged visit that he'd grabbed her and given her a big smack on the lips. But like all the others that followed it, that kiss had been closed mouth. Not like this kiss. Kissing her had nothing to do with her new look. Annie's new look was hot, but he'd always found her sexy as hell. In high school, he'd been in love with her, but he'd accepted she didn't feel the same way. When he'd kissed her just now, he stared at her, trying to get a feel of her emotional state. Had she wanted him to keep going? But her gaze flickered away from his, and she had a bright smile on her face, nothing to indicate heat was rushing through her system the way it was rushing through his. "Thanks again for the lovely gift," she said, but in contrast to her smile, her tone was cold. He almost winced. Great, she was upset. No wonder. What the hell had he been thinking, kissing her like that? Say something, Ryan. And not about her trip, not about her list. He was dying to confront her about it, but she was obviously hiding it from him, and the last thing he wanted was to make her feel cornered. He cleared his throat, forced himself to smile as he pushed her hair behind her ear. "You're welcome. So, dinner." She jolted and jumped to her feet. Right, I should check on dinner. I'll be right back." He watched her tinkering around in her kitchen while he tried to get a hold of his scrambling thoughts. He kept wanting to draw her in for another kiss, or 20. "Dinner's ready," she called out. The smell of chicken piccata wafted out with her, but Ryan's mouth watered for something else altogether. Another taste of Annie. "Ryan?"
"Yeah?"
"Dinner's ready." He got up and went over to the table. Annie had it all set up with her Christmas china. She'd served up a salad for each of them. She heaped a pile of linguine on his plate and handed him the bowl with the main dish in it. He noticed she skipped the noodles and took only a small piece of chicken for herself.
"It looks great,"
he said as he scooped the chicken dish onto his noodles. "Thanks, I hope it tastes good. I added some artichoke hearts tonight."
"I love artichokes."
"I know," she told him with a smile. "I was thinking about the time you ate the whole jar of the pickled ones back in high school, our senior year. Do you remember?" He winced.
"How could I forget? I was sick for 2 days. It was your fault, really."
"How do you figure that?"
"I was so caught up in learning what you were teaching me that I wasn't even paying attention to how many I was eating. You should have warned me."
She laughed again. "Yeah, I'm sure you were enthralled by my math lesson. I never suspected you'd eat the whole jar until I happened to glance over and they were all gone."
"It was English, not math,"
he said. "Really?"
"Yup, you were the only one who could make me enjoy English. You made me want to learn. You should have never stopped teaching me. If you hadn't, I'd be as smart as you are now."
"What are you talking about? You're a really smart guy, Ryan. You just didn't have the high grades because you were too busy chasing the cheerleaders to concentrate on school, that's all."
"Yeah, I guess high school does come with a lot of distractions," he said.
Annie had been one of those distractions. She just hadn't known it. Learning with her had been fun, but making himself stop thinking about her after tutoring time ended had been beyond difficult. In the end, he'd moved past all that. At least, he thought he had. "So how's Samantha? You haven't mentioned her once since you've been back. Afraid I'll be jealous?" He glanced over. She was obviously joking, but she wouldn't look at him. Her cheeks were flushed.
"We broke up right before I got back."
Her eyes widened and her mouth fell slightly open. "You broke up? Why didn't you say anything at the wedding?" He shrugged.
"Didn't think about it."
She suddenly started looking around the room and playing with her hair. "Oh, well, that's terrible that you broke up."
"Is it? Why?"
She looked a little startled by his question, but he really wanted to know. She didn't comment much about the women he dated. He usually figured it was because she didn't like them. When she'd met Sam, she'd made a big deal of it, telling him how perfect she was, that she could see it going somewhere long term. He'd wondered about it at the time. Sure, he'd liked Sam, but it hadn't been a case of love at first sight, so he'd found Annie's enthusiasm odd.
"Annie?"
he urged when she still didn't answer him.
"Why is it terrible that we broke up?"
"Well, I don't know. You seem to really like her." He shrugged.
"She was nice. Definitely pretty. But since I knew I'd be heading north for 2 months, I didn't take it too seriously. No surprise, given the long-distance thing hardly ever works out."
"Well, yeah, but..."
"But what?"
"I don't know. I just thought you were happy."
"What makes you think I'm not now?"
"Geez, what is this, an inquisition? So you broke up. Fine. Really, I forgot I was talking about someone who avoids commitment at all costs. I'm sure you're ready and willing to move on. Yay." She gave him a friendly thump on the arm, a clear indication she wanted to drop the topic. But for some reason he couldn't.
"Because I'm always willing to move on, you mean? You think I should be trying to settle down with just anyone?"
She stiffened and averted her gaze. "Not what I'm saying at all," she said. "In fact, I think you're right to play the field."
"You do?"
"There's a lot of great people out there to meet, a lot of fun to be had, so why not? We're young, right? Now that I've lost the weight, I'm looking forward to testing the waters." Wow. How had this suddenly turned into a conversation about her trolling for guys? It was that damn list, he thought.
"I don't know. You seemed pretty happy when you were in a relationship with that guy, the doctor."
Her expression flickered. "That was 2 years ago. Daniel was great, but there wasn't a lot of chemistry. And to be honest, even as brilliant as he was a little boring. Aside from work, he never wanted to leave the house."
"There's a lot to be said for someone who can be happy staying at home. Look at us."
He cringed, almost couldn't believe the words that had come out of him. But an Annie who enjoyed staying at home with her boyfriend seemed, if not ideal, at least preferable to an Annie who was out there hooking up with random men. "We're different," she said, looking at him strangely. "There's nothing romantic going on between us, so I wouldn't expect us to go out for a night on the town. But with a man I was going to..."
"What, marry?"
She tilted her chin up. With any man I'm involved with romantically, I want to be able to have fun in a lot of different places, not just home.
And Daniel wasn't fun.
She pressed her lips together before saying, "Not fun enough." She put her hands on her hips. "Since when are you a Daniel fan? You called him a pompous ass."
I'm not. He is. And anyway, you're right.
He took a deep breath before slowly releasing it.
You should be with a guy who can show you a good time. One who knows he's the luckiest man alive for getting to share your bed, your life.
His fists clenched at the thought of Annie meeting such a man on her trip to Vegas. Her gaze lowered. "Thanks." For an instant, she looked sad, but when she glanced up, her expression was friendly and sincere. "And you should have a relationship with a woman that no amount of time or distance can damage. A woman who'd climb mountains to make you hers. A woman who'll fight for you. Obviously, Samantha wasn't her." He shrugged.
What if that woman doesn't exist?
"She does, and when you meet her, you'll know it." He laughed.
You're something else. A good something else or a bad one? All good.
He meant it in the best way possible. So he didn't understand the sudden shadow that darkened Annie's expression, or the quick twist of her mouth before she stood and excused herself. Chapter 3. After Ryan left, confusion reigned supreme in Annie's head. What was up with that kiss? Had she imagined how amazing it had been? And how not platonic? Exhaling loudly, she plopped down onto the sofa. It had to have been a platonic kiss that had just lasted a little too long. Otherwise, he'd be here. Her crush on Ryan was something she was putting behind her. She wasn't going to dwell on one Christmas kiss. But God, it wasn't easy to forget him after he'd kissed her in a way that had her body tingling in all the right places. Ugh! Frustrated, she tried to shove the thought of kissing Ryan out of her mind and went through the motions of her nightly routine, washing her face, brushing her teeth. Then she double-checked that she had packed everything she needed for Vegas. She'd almost forgotten to pack the diet pills. Can't have that. Quickly, she dumped the bottle into her carry-on. Paige was the only one she'd told about the diet pills, and her friend had lectured Annie on using them. Yeah, Annie wasn't thrilled with the side effects, but she'd only need the pills temporarily. Besides, wasn't heart health important too? Given that high cholesterol ran in her family, she figured losing the weight, no matter which way she did it, was more important. Why, then, had she not told Ryan that she was taking diet pills? Maybe for the same reason she hadn't told her about her trip to Vegas, because he'd worry. Maybe even judge. Even if he didn't, she needed to pull away from him a little. And frankly, she'd be way too embarrassed to tell him about her naughty list. Annie climbed into bed and set her alarm. After turning off the lamp on her nightstand, she snuggled down into the covers and tried to sleep. Didn't happen. Instead, she lay there, wide awake, replaying Ryan's kiss. Those few seconds of bliss with his lips finally touching hers in a far less friendly way than normal. Annie turned onto her other side, then onto her back. She tried to think about something else, anything else. She tried to imagine what her trip was going to be like and what the handsome stranger she was going to meet on a dance floor would look like. She closed her eyes and she saw nothing but Ryan's face and Ryan's body. "Damn it," she said, sitting up and turning the light back on. She reached into her nightstand drawer and took out her e-reader. She would focus on a good old-fashioned mystery to take her mind off Ryan, and then hopefully she could get some sleep. She turned it on and pulled up the newest book she'd downloaded. It was by someone she'd never read before, but it was a murder mystery with little to no romance. Perfect. She read the first paragraph, but she couldn't get past the mixture of anxiety, confusion, and anticipation churning inside her to focus on the story. Being with Ryan, kissing Ryan, had felt so right. For those brief moments, she'd felt like herself rather than the woman she was trying so hard to change herself into. Not that change wasn't good, she hurriedly reminded herself. Only a coward would turn back now. With determination, Annie started reading, and promptly thought of Ryan and that kiss again. Ah! Annie put the e-reader down and stared at the ceiling for a solid minute before her phone rang. She glanced at her cell phone screen and saw it was Ryan. Her heartbeat accelerated. "Hey," she said, annoyed at the husky sound of her voice. She cleared her throat. "What's up?"
"Did I wake you?"
he asked. "I can't seem to sleep," she said truthfully.
"I'm not surprised."
Annie's heart started beating faster. What did that mean? Was he implying that she wouldn't be able to sleep because she was thinking about him? About the kiss they'd shared? When she didn't respond, he said,
"I saw something when I was at your place earlier, and I think you meant it to be private. Annie, I know where you're going tomorrow, and I know what your plans are."
She sucked in a breath and closed her eyes. Oh God, it was even worse than she'd feared. He knew.
"I wasn't snooping. I knocked some photos off the fridge, and all I did was pick them up. I saw the flight ticket, and Annie, I saw your list."
Ryan shoved a hand through his hair and worked to calm himself down. Breathe in, breathe out. Slowly, he reminded himself. Not working. You, Annie's voice faded out. Frustration over the list still coursed through his system. This night had given him one surprise after another, and he wasn't sure if he was standing on his own 2 feet or hanging upside down. All he knew was that after having dinner with Annie and allowing the knowledge that she had a plan to be naughty roll around in his head, he realized he couldn't let her do it. She might look a little different now, but she was still his Annie. Sweet, a good girl. He couldn't let her go to Vegas and hook up with some random guy. She'd end up hating herself. He forced out a breath.
"Come on, Annie, you're hardly making wise decisions. With the weight you've lost, you have to be taking something unhealthy. And now there's this list."
"Those are my decisions to make," she said slowly, an edge of steel in her voice. "And you have no right to dictate to me what I can and cannot do. I've lived my life doing exactly what other people have expected of me. I've always been a good girl. I've been fine with that. But in case you haven't noticed, Ryan, I've changed, and I want to explore this new side of me." He didn't want any part of this new side of her. She was perfect the way she was before. His jaw tightened.
"You think because you've lost a little weight that it's okay to compromise your principles?"
"How dare you!" she all but shouted. "This isn't about compromising who I am. This is about exploring who I've always wanted to be, a person who's comfortable in her own body and not afraid to show it. This is about me reaching for the stars and grabbing them. I know you're worried for me, and I appreciate your concern, but I need to do this."
"Tell me what this trip to Vegas is really about."
"Why, so you can tell me again what a stupid idea it is?"
"I won't, I promise. I'm sorry I came off like a Neanderthal. It's just, that list took me by surprise. You've taken me by surprise. You look different. You seem to want different things. I don't even know if I know you anymore, and that scares me."
The vulnerability in his words seemed to give her pause and penetrate her anger because she hesitated for a few seconds. When she spoke, her voice was softer, gentler. "You know me, Ryan. I'm the same person. I just want to be more adventurous. It's never too late, right?" His mind scrambled for an answer that would be supportive, yet not so supportive that it would encourage her on her reckless path. Okay, so he could see how she might want to be more adventurous, but damn it, she couldn't put herself in danger. How could he help give her what she needed, but in a way that was safe? The idea came to him out of nowhere, shocking him. But he leaped on it instantly.
"Annie, you want to be a bad girl, right? Well, you can be pretty darn bad in ways that don't involve getting on that plane tomorrow. With me, now, on the phone."
Chapter 4. Wait, what had Ryan just said? Annie's chest tightened up on her, and suddenly she found it difficult to breathe. He was joking, right? He couldn't be serious. "Now you're just messing with me, Ryan, and I don't appreciate it." She more than didn't appreciate it. She started to get angry. How dare he play games about something that was so important to her? Was the idea of her being a bad girl that ridiculous to him?
"I'm completely serious, Annie."
"Sure you are," she scoffed. This is exactly why I didn't tell you about my list. I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. You just need to accept that I've given this a lot of thought."
Really? Because the Annie I know would never do that.
"You don't know everything about me," she said.
"Maybe you don't know how dangerous the things on your list can be,"
he said with genuine concern in his voice.
"Have you thought about that, Annie?"
"I trust my judgment," she said, even though her belly had nodded. "I'm willing to take the risks. I need to take risks."
"Maybe you should have told me that sooner," he shot back. "Because, like I said, I'm willing to help out, especially because keeping you safe is the most important thing in the world to me."
Her head was reeling. Ryan was serious. "What are you suggesting, exactly?" she asked.
"You and I are best friends, right? I'll pretend to be your fantasy dude. You do have a fantasy dude, right?"
Wow. Her heart pounded wildly. She had to act calm, cool. "Of course I do."
"Tell me his name."
"What?"
"His name. Who is it?"
"Let's just call him Kyle."
"Fine, I'll pretend to be Kyle. Just imagine it's Kyle whose voice is on the other end of the line."
"Ryan," she paused, not knowing what to say. The line was silent for several seconds.
"What are you wearing, Annie?"
he asked, a low timbre entering his voice. Annie flushed. Her whole body tingled. "I'm not sure I can do this with you."
"It's not me you're talking to. It's not me you're fantasizing about. Now close your eyes and see me. See Kyle. Tell Kyle what you're wearing."
She swallowed hard, gripped the phone harder. Her face was burning up and the heat was traveling down her neck into her chest. But she wanted more. What if he did too? What if the reason he didn't want her to go to Vegas was because the thought of her being with another man made him jealous? She struggled with her own cowardice. The silence on the other end of the line was palpable. Seconds ticked by, and with each one Annie felt the throb of humiliation in her veins, constricting her throat and mind.
"Annie,"
he finally began, his voice way too hesitant.
"Annie, babe."
She winced. "Never mind, I have to get up early tomorrow for my flight." A sudden and powerful wave of loneliness passed through her. Hurt and anger quickly followed.
"Annie, you can't be serious. You're still planning on going to Vegas? Because I just don't understand."
"You don't need to understand." She tried her best to keep her voice light. "This is for me, about me. I need to prove something to myself. I need to be adventurous for a change, and there isn't anything you or anyone else can do to stop me.
But
I'm going to go to sleep now. Have a good night, and I'll talk to you later, okay?"
"Annie."
"Good night, Ryan," she said, then disconnected the call before he could hear the sobs that suddenly tore through her. Chapter 5. When Ryan was a kid, his grandparents used to take him to a place along the river near where he lived. They would fish, and Ryan would run and play and climb the rocks. When it was warm, he would take a dip in the river and cool off. His grandmother would set up a picnic for them in a little cove that was closed off from the elements. She was a wonderful cook, and those were some of the best times Ryan had ever known. He hadn't been there since the summer he turned 14 when his grandpa died. He thought about going back sometimes, but it was one of those places that he wanted to go with people he loved. In his dream, he and Annie were there, and it was nighttime. They'd eaten their picnic dinner and were lying on their backs, looking up at the stars. He was pointing out the constellations to her, making up stories about them, and she was laughing at his silly jokes. Impulsively, he sat up and said, "I'm hot. I think I'll go for a swim. Want to join me?" "I didn't bring a swimsuit," Annie said. Ryan had already started undressing.
"You don't need a swimsuit," he told her. "I didn't bring one."
Annie gave him a strange look. "Are you going in your underwear?"
"Nope, I'm going in the buff."
He was already stripped down to his boxers. He grinned at her and vaulted over the rocks that separated them from the river. He took his boxers off then, realizing even in his dream that he was taking a bold risk. He splashed around after he waded in, trying to get her attention. Finally, he saw her stand up and look over the rocks.
"It's refreshing," he told her. "You should come in. You won't regret it."
"Naked?" she said. "No thanks."
"Then just leave your bra and panties on. They cover the same as a bikini, right?"
The top of her head disappeared. A few minutes later, she reappeared, and to his surprise, she wore only a red lacy bra and a pair of tiny red panties. She was round and beautiful the way she used to be. She still had those curves he loved. Her sweet belly looked the way he'd always imagined, soft, welcoming.
"So, you're coming in?"
he said. "No, I just felt like standing around in my underwear."
"I'm okay with that, too,"
he told her with a grin. Annie stuck her tongue out and headed toward the water. She looked gorgeous in the moonlight, and it was all he could do to keep from swimming over and taking her into his arms. She waded in slowly, and as he went toward her, she said, "No, you stay back, Mr. Naked."
"Aw, come on, Annie," Ryan said with a pout. "I just want one little kiss."
"Stay back," she hollered, splashing in his direction. He continued toward her as she splashed him, growing bolder with each stroke. "I'm not kidding," she said, but she was laughing. Ryan grabbed at her, and she took a step back, stumbled and fell into the water. Ryan dived under and carried her back to the surface.
"Oh God, Annie, I'm so sorry,"
he said, feeling terrible for making her fall. He thought she was crying. Her shoulders were shaking, and her hair was hanging down in her face. She pushed it back over her shoulders, and he could see that she was laughing. He was so relieved that, without even thinking about it, he kissed her. It wasn't a friendly kiss, it was a hard kiss, one that would have turned passionate had it lasted a few seconds longer. She pulled back, and he could see the rise and fall of her chest.
"I'm sorry."
"I'm not," she said, then covered his mouth with hers. Ryan's heart beat faster with excitement, and he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her into him. He couldn't believe he was holding her this close, his naked chest pressing against her wet, scantily clad body. After all this time, she'd kissed him. She wanted him. Her lips parted slightly, and he took it as an invitation. The blare of the alarm jolted Ryan awake. For a minute, he stared at the ceiling, chest heaving. He remembered this, the dreams of frustration and longing for something he'd never have. He'd lived with them all for years before he'd finally accepted that Annie just didn't feel the same way about him. That had been back in high school, or at least college. Hell, maybe he hadn't truly accepted it until a couple of years ago. But the point was, he eventually had, and he'd done it before he'd done something stupid like telling her how he felt. Bullet dodged. It had all worked out in the end. Even if Annie had been attracted to him and they'd acted on their feelings, he would have eventually disappointed her, hurt her. As time had revealed, Ryan had a hard time committing, whether it was to a major in college, a career, or a romantic relationship. On the other hand, he'd never had a problem committing to his friends, probably because he gravitated to friendships that were easy. Annie's friendship was by far the easiest thing he'd ever committed to. So why now? Why was he suddenly right back where he'd started, wanting Annie so much it hurt? Oh, right, her naughty list. The kiss. Groaning, Ryan closed his eyes and dug his palms into his eye sockets. He sat up in his bed and blearily glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 5 a.m. He had 45 minutes until he needed to meet his friend Cole at the gym to work out. Cole lived in LA and along with their friend Luke ran a private security business called Frontline Incorporated. They were getting busier and busier to the point where they were thinking of opening a second office in San Francisco. Cole had spent the past few days meeting with potential clients and they'd agreed to work out today before he headed back south. Ryan blew out a breath. The last thing he felt like doing right now was hitting the weights. But it wasn't like he could do what he really wanted to do either. He rose out of bed and headed to the bathroom. He leaned against the bathroom sink and stared blurry-eyed at his reflection. An hour later, he managed to make it to the gym and onto a treadmill next to the one that Cole was running on. Around them, men and women were lifting weights, running on the assorted cardio machines, and punching sandbags. This was a serious gym, and Cole was a focused exercise partner. Because he was a private bodyguard, staying fit was just an extension of who he was, the same way it was for Ryan.
"Have you heard anything more from Eric?"
Cole asked. Still running, Ryan took a drink from his water bottle, swallowed, then answered,
"Nope, it's beyond bizarre. He's loved Brienne since the day he met her."
"We all love Brienne," Cole said between breaths.
Maybe that's the problem. What do you mean? We love Brienne because we've known her so long. Maybe Eric realized he didn't want to be tied down to the same woman he'd been with since college.
In other words, romantic love didn't last, not like friendship did.
Maybe. I suppose we won't know the truth until he shows back up or contacts one of us.
Eric's disappearance had them all on edge. Sure, their group of friends weren't as close as they'd been in college, but there was a deep connection that held them together, similar to the connection he had with Annie. He didn't know what he'd do if Annie took off for parts unknown. It seemed that by losing the weight, Annie had changed not only outside, but inside too. Irritated at where his mind kept going, he punched the speed on the treadmill higher and sprinted until sweat poured off of him. Yeah, that's right, he'd sweat Annie out of his system. But 30 minutes later, off the treadmill and holding a barbell over his friend as Cole adjusted position on the weight bench, Ryan still had Annie at the forefront of his mind. Damn.
Can you lift the bar a little higher?
Cole asked.
Will do,
Ryan said, focusing on the heavy barbell. But his mind wandered to Annie yet again and the bar slipped, just a bit, but enough to send Cole back up to a seated position, glaring at him.
Dude, you want to tell me what or who you're so distracted about? I take it it's a girl?
Ryan let the heavy weight settle back into the cradle and ran a hand over his face.
Yeah, you could say that. Samantha, I thought you dumped her the way you dumped them all.
The comment smarted a bit. He didn't dump all the women he went out with. Some left him when they realized he wouldn't make a major commitment.
I didn't dump her. It was mutual, but you're right, I'm not seeing her anymore.
Ryan wiped sweat from his forehead and sat on the weight bench next to Cole.
So who are you?
Understanding lit Cole's eyes.
Ah, is this about Annie?
Startled, Ryan turned his gaze to meet Cole's steady one.
How'd you know?
Cole shrugged.
That girl means more to you than all your other friends combined, and you've got your Mr. Protective vibe going on.
Ryan glowered at him.
It's true,
Cole said.
The first time I saw them together was in college, when she came to visit and you wouldn't let any of us ask her out. You said none of us was good enough for her, but it's been obvious for years that you don't think you're good enough for her. At least, not good enough to keep her. It's a cruel, endless cycle, dude. You don't know what you're talking about. Is that right? Then why don't you tell me what's got you so twisted up?
Ryan couldn't. He couldn't betray Annie's confidence by telling anyone about her naughty list. But
she's heading to Vegas today, alone. Why is she?
Again, that look of understanding flashed across his friend's face.
Ah, a little tit for tat, maybe? Huh? You were in Vegas last week for the bachelor party. Maybe she's imagining you doing all sorts of things. Maybe she's pissed as hell about it, so she's dishing out some payback.
The idea stunned Ryan. It wasn't possible. Annie didn't play those kinds of games. Well, the old Annie wouldn't anyway. This new Annie hadn't even told him she was going to Vegas. Cole handed him a water bottle. Ryan stared at it.
You know, she lost a lot of weight recently.
He began slowly. Nodding, Cole said,
She's a bit on the skinny side now. I liked her with more meat on her bones. But I have to admit, she seemed different at the wedding. More confident. So she's going to Vegas to see exactly what her new body can do for her? Maybe, Ryan grumbled. I tried talking her out of it, but...
For a long while, Cole simply sat, staring ahead at the hustle and bustle of the gym. Finally, he said,
When does she leave? 3 hours? You know what they say,
Cole said. Ryan lifted his head.
No, what do they say? If you can't beat 'em, join 'em. Meaning, go with her, and while you're there, figure out what you want. If you could have her, would you want her?
His first thought was, hell yes, Annie was beautiful, smart, fun, and kind. The women he dated inevitably came up short when compared to her. But the problem was, he wanted Annie for a lifetime.
I want to be her friend. But what if you can be more?
She's not interested in me in any other way than friendship, Ryan said.
She wasn't in high school, and she's not now. She said it herself. She wants to test the waters, and a girl who wants that is someone ready to move on at a moment's notice. As you pointed out, that's standard operating procedure for me. Eventually, for one of us, it wouldn't be enough, and I could lose her forever.
It wasn't worth the risk.
Let's talk about something else. Any news on the real estate front?
Cole had his own place in downtown LA, but he'd been putting off selling his mother's home in one of the surrounding suburbs. His mom had passed away 3 months before from breast cancer. Though he didn't talk about it, Cole had been close to his mother, who'd raised him on her own. Cole would be grieving her loss for a long time to come, but selling her house would be an important part of him moving forward.
Not yet,
Cole said.
I took so much time off when she was really sick, and right after. I can't keep leaving things to Luke to run on his own.
He stood and turned at the sound of girlish giggles. There were a couple of young women on the treadmills, and they waved at Cole and Ryan. Ryan smirked.
Looks like you've got a fan club. It's you. They want some Fireboy lovin',
Cole said.
No, they clearly want some biker boy action. Wait, I think I can read their lips.
He spoke softly, but with a slightly girly tone.
Look at that one, the one with all the tats. Oh, he's so dreamy. Just imagine what it would feel like to touch all that hard muscle, to feel that goatee against your skin, to ride his bike.
Cole snorted.
Since you can't seem to spot me worth a damn, I'll spot you. I don't want to be in a high-rise when a fire breaks out and have to worry about whether your fat ass can make it to the top floor to save me.
Ryan grinned and got back into his workout. It would be a cold day in hell before Cole needed rescuing from anyone. He'd be the first person Ryan would want taking his back. And it wasn't all brawn and no heart with Cole either. Every other weekend, he and his biker friends got on their bikes and did a run for one charity or another. Most of the time it was for kids, but lately he'd been doing cancer runs. 2 weeks ago, Cole and all of his tough biker friends had been wearing hot pink ribbons for breast cancer awareness. Cole glanced back at the girls again as he spotted for Ryan.
Why don't you just go over and say hello? Ryan said. Nah, they're cute, but I don't have time to get involved right now. The way they're looking at you, they might be up for a drive-by.
Cole chuckled.
No time for even that. You, on the other hand, have the whole weekend free.
Ryan arched a brow.
You're suggesting I go over there and chat them up? Nope, I know you're not interested, and something tells me you don't have the time either.
Why's that? Cole tossed Ryan a towel.
You're gonna have to hustle to make that flight to Vegas.
Chapter 6. The first boarding call for Annie's flight echoed through the San Francisco airport. All around her, people jockeyed for position, even though the flight had assigned seating. Oof, Annie grunted as she bent to pick up her carry-on bag, trying to move it away from a rather oblivious group of travelers. She'd bagged up all her clothes after she'd lost the weight and taken the bags to the local homeless shelter, then bought all new, form-fitting clothes to show off her new look. But skinny jeans meant just that, skinny, and bending over in pants that were practically painted on was proving rather difficult. And she'd certainly shoved a lot of stuff into her carry-on bag. Her stomach clenched and a surge of panic washed over her. Was she really going to get naughty in Vegas? Next to her, a young woman stood, latte in hand, chatting with a nearly identical woman. Both girls were in their mid-20s and dressed in designer clothes that fit their rail-thin bodies like a glove. Yep, this trip was definitely going to be a turning point in her transformation. The announcement came loudly that her group was boarding. She hefted her carry-on over her shoulder and got in line behind the two young women. In her back pocket, her cell phone buzzed. She pulled it out to see a text from Ryan.
So you're still going to Vegas?
She smiled slightly, practically hearing his frown in the words. Yes, no, going back now.
I can't convince you otherwise.
No, now stop bothering me.
I'm worried for you. Vegas can be a dangerous place.
She sighed. She got it. Ryan was a good friend. The line moved forward, and she with it, until she was suddenly standing in front of the airplane. She'd have to text back, but right now she needed to find her seat. It took several minutes of waiting behind other people as they shoved their carry-ons into the overhead bins and settled into their seats, but she finally located her window seat toward the back. Thankfully, the two chattering young women who had annoyed her earlier were seated somewhere in the front. The plane wasn't crowded, and she was pleased to see she had several empty seats around her. She shoved her carry-on into the overhead bin and then settled down in her seat. As the plane's engine started, she texted Ryan back. I adore you for caring, but this is it. Vegas. Naughty list. There's nothing you can do to stop me.
Maybe I can't stop you, but I sure as hell can join you.
Annie stiffened and gasped, jerking with disbelief when she saw Ryan standing over her, wearing a baseball cap, worn jeans, a blue Henley, and a broad smile. What are you doing here? She choked out. Fearing she was losing her mind, she blinked several times. But no, he was still there, grinning like a madman. He stowed his carry-on bag and plopped down in the aisle seat next to her, his muscular frame spilling over the side of the small seat. What are you doing here? She exclaimed. Ryan fiddled with the seatbelt.
Like I said, I'm joining you.
What? Why? You can't come with me. Panic, worry, and irritation all fought for dominance. Why on earth was Ryan here? And what did he mean he was joining her? Joining her how? He finally turned to her.
Since I can't talk you out of this crazy plan, I'm going with you as your chaperone.
Annie's pulse quickened more, and she could feel her breath shortening. My chaperone?
Yep, someone has to make sure that you don't get hurt. You don't seem to be giving much thought to your own safety lately.
Really? He didn't trust her to have good judgment and keep herself safe from harm? And how do you propose to keep me safe? Follow me around? Stay in my hotel room with me? Run background checks on any guy I flirt with?
Hadn't thought about the background checks. Sounds like a good idea.
Ryan! That was a horrible idea. A terrible idea. There was no way he could come on this trip with her. He would ruin everything. She was supposed to be getting over him, not falling more in love with him.
Besides, I needed a break from work,
he said.
I'm off this weekend, and I can even extend my time off. It'll be fun to hang out with you. Remember the last time we went to Vegas together?
Did she ever? That trip had inspired the location of this one, actually. Girls had climbed all over Ryan. Now she needed the same to happen for her so she could free him from her heart in that way forever. She could not embark on this grand adventure of naughtiness in Vegas with her best friend, the very man she was trying to get over, playing wingman. For the first time, she noticed how fatigued and anxious he looked. She wondered if more was going on with him than he'd let on last night. She wanted to ask him, make sure he was okay. But now really wasn't the time. I'm not doing this trip to hang out and play the slots, she said. I'm doing this to shake things up in my life. And I'm sorry, but I don't need you, and I really don't want you to be hanging out with me while I'm trying to meet a man to have fun with.
Too bad.
Ryan shrugged and dropped his gaze, then reached into his pocket of the seat in front of him and pulled out an in-flight magazine.
This is how I'll be able to keep my peace of mind. You can pretend I'm your brother. If a guy's really interested, having me around won't stop him from coming on to you. But it will stop the assholes from trying to pick you up.
The flight attendant asked everyone to get in their seats over the PA, and soon the airplane door would close. I don't need you with me. I don't want you to come along, she fumed, blowing out a sharp breath, wishing it was really true. She unbuckled his seatbelt and pointed down the aisle. Now get off this plane. Now!
Not going to happen,
he said, thumbing through the magazine as if he hadn't noticed her outburst. She yanked the magazine out of his hands. Ryan Hennessy, I swear. He suddenly cupped her face in his hand so that her words died off.
Listen to me, Annie, he said. If you insist on going forward with your ridiculous plan, I'm not going to stand in your way, but I am going to make sure you come back home intact and unscathed.
He leaned forward and gave her a gentle, closed-mouthed kiss.
You can take that to the bank.
After they took off, Ryan tried to stretch his long legs out, which meant having to shove his feet under the seat in front of him just to keep his knees out of his face. He glanced over at Annie, who stared out the window, giving him the silent treatment. He rubbed his hands across his face, wondering again if he was making a serious mistake by following her to Vegas. In trying to protect her, would he piss her off so much that it would irreparably harm their friendship? All he knew was that he couldn't let her wander around Vegas by herself. She was still staring out the window, but her expression had softened, like she was too caught up in thoughts about her upcoming adventure to be angry at him anymore. God, she made his chest ache. She was pure, simple beauty, and she had no idea how much he wanted her. Of course, he understood she wanted more confidence, but she shouldn't achieve that by pretending to be someone she wasn't. And he couldn't let Cole's questions play with his head either. Annie didn't want more from him than friendship. She was doing exactly what she'd told him last night, testing out her new look and trying to have some casual fun. He needed to be practical. He'd tell Annie about the job offer he'd received, but only after they dealt with whatever was going on with her. They'd have to work a little harder to nourish their friendship if he lived farther away, but they could do it.
"So, where are we staying?"
he asked. Annie briefly glared at him before turning back to the window.
"Come on, Annie," he urged. "You know I've got your best interests at heart here, right?"
He watched her turn and stare at him, so he repeated himself.
"Right?"
Her stiff body seemed to relax slightly, and she sighed. She rubbed her temple. "I know that, Ryan. You're a good friend. My best friend. But I'm a grown woman, and you're treating me like a child."
"I just want more time with you, Annie. Time to understand what's going on inside that pretty head of yours. I know you're not a child."
He thought quickly, knowing he had to convince her to listen to him.
"If you decide you want to go forward with your plan, I promise I won't interfere. Like I said, I'll even help you choose a guy to flirt with tonight, but I need to make sure you're going to be safe. Will you give me that, please?"
A shadow flickered over her face. "Treasure Island," she finally said.
"What?"
"That's where I'm staying. Now, do you mean what you said? You promise that you'll back off? Because I'm going to do more than flirt with a guy I can find on my own, by the way." He looked at her, then forced himself to say,
"Aye, matey."
She smiled, and he sighed dramatically.
"There's that smile. You know I can't stand you being mad at me."
He pulled his hat down low over his eyes and said,
"I think I'll take a little nap."
He closed his eyes and pretended to nod off. A few minutes later, Annie asked, "Ryan, what is going on with you?" He pushed his hat back up with his fingertips and said,
"If I'm acting out of character, Annie, it's because I'm trying to keep up with you."
"I'm looking for adventure. What are you looking for?"
"What I'm always looking for. To be your friend."
"That's it? Just my friend?" Was she afraid that he was going to try to make a move on her? Ruin her chances of hooking up with another man? Annoyance ran through him. He'd already agreed to let her go through with her damn plan if he wouldn't change her mind. What did she want? For him to sign in blood? He hesitated.
"Being your friend is the most important thing in the world to me, Annie. So yeah, just your friend, like always."
She smiled tightly, nodded. "It's the most important thing to me too, Ryan." He smiled back and pulled his hat back down, closing his eyes. But peace was the last thing he felt. Chapter 7. Annie and Ryan didn't say anything else to each other until the plane landed and the pilot turned off the fasten seatbelt sign.
"Did you rest?"
he asked her. "No, I'm too excited to sleep." She stood in her new sandals that made her feel sexy. If only balancing in them weren't such a struggle, not to mention her toes had gone numb by the time they reached the jetway. "Not too late to book your return flight home. I'll even pay for it."
"Not a chance."
He stopped at the door and let her go first, following her up the ramp then through the terminal to baggage claim where they waited in silence. When their bags arrived, Ryan reached for hers. "I've got it. Not a little girl, remember?" He rolled his eyes but let it go. Annie liked her independence, and usually Ryan didn't have a problem with that, but lately he wanted to do everything for her, like this whole following her to Vegas thing. Was it really about being protective? Did he simply not trust her judgment anymore just because she was adding some zing to her boring life? Whatever, she was done arguing with him since he obviously wasn't going to budge.
"Did you reserve a car?"
he asked as they started to leave baggage claim. "No, I'm going to get the shuttle to the hotel. I don't plan on leaving the Strip. Everything I'm looking for should be within walking distance or at my hotel."
"So you've indicated,"
he said, his jaw muscles flexing. The shuttle was easy to grab, and it took less than 30 minutes to get to their hotel. The pirate show was going on in front of the resort, and Annie stopped for a moment to watch. It was crowded, and Ryan stood close behind her. She felt his hot breath on her neck, and the image of him wrapping his hands around her waist and attaching his lips to the spot where she could feel him breathing ran through her head. She shivered, closing her eyes for a second to shake it off. From there, Annie checked into her room. Ryan managed to land the room next to hers thanks to the very helpful front desk clerk who wanted to make sure they'd enjoy their stay. As they walked through the casino toward the elevator, his arm brushed hers and she imagined Ryan grabbing her, shoving her against the wall and kissing her passionately. They made it up to the 5th floor where their rooms were. She slid her key card into the lock and pushed the door open, taking in the tidy, spacious room. Wanting to be prepared for anything, she'd opted for an upgrade with a small dining table and kitchenette. The king bed looked huge and comfy. Realizing Ryan had followed her in, she turned to face him and saw his gaze stuck on the bed. "Ryan?" He jerked, cleared his throat. "I'm kind of hungry. Do you want to grab a bite to eat with me, or do you want to start trolling Vegas for men?" She nudged his arm, feeling the massive muscle there and getting a little chill. "Both sound enticing. That's a tough one," she said with a smile. "Lunch sounds great, actually. Give me a bit to change and clean up to get the feeling of airplane ride off me." "Good." Ryan looked her up and down, slowly dragging his eyes over her body with such erotic intensity that she actually felt her face go hot and a gush of moisture between her legs. His tongue darted out just slightly between his parted lips before he said, "Okay, see you in a bit." Annie closed the door behind him and leaned up against it, trying to catch her breath. She tried to shake off thoughts of Ryan as she put her things away and got ready for an afternoon out in Vegas. She put on a short-sleeve, form-fitting red dress first. It ended just above the knee and looked nice, but it was also practical. It moved with her and was really comfortable. She just finished getting ready when there was a knock on her door. It was Ryan, and he let out a low whistle when she let him in. She blushed. "Will you stop it?" she scolded again. "Right now we're going to lunch, but my plan starts full force tonight." "Are you getting the tattoo tonight? Tomorrow?" "Nope, Monday. That gives me today and Sunday to scratch off the other items on my list, and then I'll end the weekend with a tattoo. I've researched and made an appointment at a popular shop. Great work and a pristine reputation. I figured it wouldn't make sense to get the tattoo first." She smiled seductively and raised her brows. Limits where a guy can put his hands. His eyes widened slightly and red flags appeared on his cheekbones. "So where's the tat going?" "I haven't decided for sure," she told him. "What do you think?" "What kind of tattoo were you thinking of getting?" "I have a picture that's special to me," she told him. "It's a little group of flowers, and it's really colorful and feminine. I love it." It actually reminded her of the first bouquet of flowers she'd ever received from a guy. Ryan had bought her peonies for her high school graduation. "Let me see," he said. She tensed and hesitated, wondering if he'd recognize the tattoo's significance. Unlikely. She took a piece of paper out of her purse and unfolded it. She handed it to him, and he studied it for a few seconds. Then he said, "Come here. I want to hold this sketch against you and see what our viable options are." His voice was definitely deeper than normal, but his face was composed. Hesitantly, she stepped closer to him. He held the picture up to the side of her arm and shook his head. "Too military there." "Military?" "Yeah, you know, soldiers get tats on their delt, and guys named Bubba that work out too much. I don't think you fit either bill." She laughed weakly. Soldiers and guys who work out are usually pretty yummy, though." Ryan stepped closer. "Not as yummy as firemen, though, right?" Like she was going to touch that question with a 10-foot pole. Not. He slid the picture along the thin material of her dress and lowered it to the top of her thigh. Through the crisp paper, she felt the warmth of his touch, the pressure from each individual fingertip. Annie's pulse raced, and she began to feel lightheaded before she realized that she was holding her breath. "Not quite right either. Turn around," he told her. She turned her back to him, and he lifted her hair and set it to the front of her shoulder. His fingers brushed her neck, and she shivered. Goosebumps prickled up both her arms, and she hoped he wouldn't notice. He held the picture to her upper back between her shoulders, and she heard him clear his throat. "What?" she asked.
"Nothing. I love the curve of your back. I always have."
He continued sliding the paper down and rested it on her lower back. He placed a hand on each of her hips as he held the picture against her. Annie's mouth had gone extremely dry. It seemed like he was taking an extraordinarily long time in that area. "Any ideas?" she said, trying to hurry him up before she keeled over. God, the things they could be doing with his hands in that position.
"I think this is the spot,"
he said. She breathed a sigh of relief as she felt him release her, and at the same time she missed his touch. Ryan smirked and she wanted to punch him.
"You haven't changed that much, Annie. That's what confuses me about all of this. Why have you suddenly decided to pick up a stranger? That's not the responsible Annie I've known and loved all these years."
"Maybe you don't need to know or understand everything about me," she said.
"Maybe I don't,"
he said.
"I was hoping you'd see you'd have other options and not go through with this trip. I failed."
Maybe he meant she failed him. Suddenly, she couldn't shake the feeling that the very thing she'd wanted to avoid, Ryan judging her or finding her lacking somehow, even as a friend, was happening. That knowledge, along with his stubborn presence and her unwavering feelings for him, ripped a hole inside her. "You can either have lunch with me before you head back to San Francisco, or you can leave right now. Either way, I'm making my own choices." Annie's legs were shaking as she grabbed her purse and headed toward the door. Before she got there, Ryan stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm.
"Annie, I'm sorry."
He rubbed a hand through his hair, his expression pensive.
"I'm just worried."
She hung her head and stared at her cute new sandals and flirty pedicure. Why was she even bothering to lose weight and wear new clothes? She'd been fooling herself with this whole get-over-Ryan plan. Deep down, she was afraid she knew why she'd wanted to surprise him with her new look. Part of her had hoped he'd take one look at her and miraculously realize he'd loved her all this time. Instead, all she'd done was worry him. She didn't fight him when he hooked a finger under her chin so she'd meet his serious gaze.
"You are the most important person in the world to me, Annie. Forgive me, please."
Her heart melted, like she could resist the guy anything when he said things like that, looking at her like he'd die if she stayed mad at him. It wasn't his fault he didn't return her feelings. With a final sniff, she nodded. "Fine, but lunch is on you, and I don't want to hear your opinions about my list while we eat."
"But
I mean it, Ryan. Either you drop it for now or we're going to have some serious problems." His jaw ticked as he struggled with what to say, then he finally nodded.
"Fine, I won't talk about your list over lunch. Now can I please have a hug?"
He didn't wait for her to answer before enfolding her in his arms. In that moment, she forgot about her list, forgot about being naughty, and just hugged her friend. Chapter 8. Annie and Ryan settled on a nice steakhouse at the Mirage for lunch. The hostess was a petite blonde dressed in a skirt that left way too little to the imagination, in Annie's opinion. The girl gushed over Ryan as she showed them to their table and handed him a menu. She laid Annie's down on the table in front of her. At least it was within her reach. "Where y'all from?" she asked. Although she'd said y'all, she hadn't even glanced in Annie's direction.
"San Francisco," Ryan told her.
"Oh, I've always wanted to go there. I've come this far from Tennessee, but I haven't made it to California yet. Maybe if I knew somebody to visit, someone who could show me around, I might get motivated about heading out west." Annie almost laughed out loud. What a ridiculous line. Ryan obviously didn't think so.
"I'm a firefighter at Station 54 in San Francisco. If you ever make it out, look me up. Ryan Hennessy. I'll show you all the hot spots. Nobody knows hot better than a firefighter."
The girl giggled, and Annie, who was looking at Ryan behind the girl's back, made a gag face. She could tell that Ryan was trying not to laugh. "Well then, I'll have to plan a trip," she said. Then, as if suddenly noticing Annie was there, she looked at her and said, "What can I get you to drink, hon?" "Iced tea," Annie said. The hostess turned back to Ryan and smiled, this time wide enough to show her dimple. "And for you, sweetie?"
"I'll have whatever IPA you've got on tap," he said with an answering smile.
Annie could taste the bile at the back of her throat. When the hostess walked away and Ryan finally tore his eyes from her ass, Annie said,
How does she know we're not a couple? This is Vegas. Maybe she was hitting on us both.
Right, she didn't even know I was here for the first 5 minutes. Ryan chuckled, but left it at that. A few minutes later, a male waiter brought them their drinks and took their orders. The hostess had gone back to her post, but every time she sashayed by, she made goo-goo eyes at Ryan. She wasn't the only one, either. There were 2 college-age girls sitting across from them who couldn't take their eyes off of him. Every time he glanced in their direction, they would put their heads together and giggle.
So what's the plan for this afternoon?
He asked her. Annie supposed with all the attention he was getting, she should be glad he remembered she was there. I want to look around the hotels, check out the clubs before they get packed, and figure out which one I want to go to. Oh, I definitely want to catch a show before going out dancing, maybe a magic show.
You want dessert?
He asked after they finished eating. No thanks, she said. I already ate too much. I'm going to have to work out in the morning.
You barely ate anything, Annie. I think you're taking this diet thing too far.
I thought you were going to stop bothering me about my weight.
I just want to make sure you know that nothing is good in excess.
I do know that. I'm a nurse, remember? They teach us those sorts of things in school. Excuse me, Ryan? A female voice interrupted. They turned to see their hostess hovering close by. You invited me to come to see you in San Francisco, so I just want to confirm. She looked at Annie. That is. She turned back to Ryan. You are single? He stared at her for a few seconds, then glanced at Annie, his expression uncomfortable. She stood abruptly. He sure is, but that never lasts for long, so you're smart to move now. She forced herself to smile brightly at the blonde. Ryan, I'm going to wait outside. I'm a little cold. Can you pay the bill and I'll pay you back?
Annie,
he began. She turned back. Yes? He hesitated. Looked torn.
Lunch is on me, remember? I'll just pay the bill and meet you out there in a sec. Don't get into any trouble without me.
With a sigh, Annie exited the restaurant. It was nice and warm outside. She had stepped out the side door of the casino and was facing the far side of the hotel. There wasn't much foot traffic on this side, and it was nice to just have a moment to herself to breathe. She looked out toward the strip and watched all the people walking by. Everyone looked excited, happy. She didn't know why Ryan thought she couldn't handle this place on her own. It was like a grown-up Disneyland. To distract herself from Ryan taking his time hitting on the hostess, Annie walked over to take a picture of one of the bronze statues that surrounded the Mirage. She had her phone out and was about to snap the picture when she suddenly felt a hard tug on her shoulder bag. Startled, she tightened her grip on it, but then felt the strap snap with a force that had her stumbling back into some bushes. The ground was wet and muddy, causing her to slip and fall back onto her butt, hard. An enormous, bald man, who now had her handbag, leaned in and grabbed the necklace Ryan had just given her. He snapped it off her neck and took off running. It all happened so fast that Annie barely had time to process it.
Annie, oh my God, what happened? Are you okay?
Ryan said anxiously as he bolted out of the casino and saw Annie sprawled in the bushes. He took my necklace, was all she could think to say. Tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't worried about the purse. Everything in the purse could be replaced, but the necklace. Ryan had given it to her right before he'd kissed her.
Who did? What did he look like?
He scanned the crowd for someone to go after. There were people milling around, staring at her. He was bald, wearing a big sweatshirt. He had a scar on his left cheek. Oh God, I'm a mess. Everyone is staring at me. I'm pathetic.
Here.
Ryan leaned down and slid his arms underneath hers. He pulled her into a bear hug and picked her up. When she was on her feet, he stepped back just a tad without letting her go.
Oh, baby, are you okay?
I'm okay, she said. Just sad my necklace is gone and embarrassed.
Annie, that creep attacked you. You could have been hurt. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. Here,
he said, taking out his phone.
I'm calling the police.
Ryan used his phone to look up the number for the Las Vegas PD, and as he dialed, Annie realized she still gripped her own phone in her hand. While Ryan was on the phone, Annie tried to brush herself off. It was no use. The more she brushed at it, the deeper the mud was embedded in her clothes and on her skin. Her new shoes were smeared with mud, and when she'd fallen back, she'd hit her knee on the small wrought iron fence that surrounded the statue. It was bleeding a little and throbbing. Some of the people milling around were kind enough to ask her if she needed help. She politely declined. I seriously can't believe my luck. Everyone else comes to Vegas, dresses up sexy, and has a fabulous time. I come to Vegas, and I get knocked in the mud and robbed. Go figure. Ryan disconnected the call.
They want us to come into the station so you can give them a formal statement. Are you up for that? If you're not, I'll tell them to meet us at the hotel.
Can I change clothes and clean up first? She was trying so hard not to cry, but the sting of embarrassment burned in her chest. The tears took on a mind of their own and streamed down her face. Ryan looked horrified. He took her in his arms, saying,
I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have left you alone.
His words made her cry even harder. Eventually, she pulled her head off his shoulder and said, It's not your fault. I'm an adult. I shouldn't need a babysitter. I'm just so mortified. Look at me.
You're beautiful,
he said.
And as soon as we get home, I'll buy you another necklace, the exact same one.
She wanted to cry again, but she fought the tears back. You don't have to do that. Can I please go change? She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone who walked by was still staring at her, thinking of her as the kind of woman who obviously couldn't handle Vegas alone.
Yes, of course, he said. Then we'll get a cab to the police station.
They started walking back toward their hotel. He kept an arm around her, and he winced in sympathy with every limping step she took. He really was a good friend, and she was so lucky to have him. When they got back out to the main strip, Ryan didn't act like he even noticed all of the people looking at them. I'm sorry that you have to be seen with a big disheveled mess. Everyone else looks amazing, dressed for Vegas, and I look ridiculous.
You're not big, he said, obviously joking.
His forehead wrinkled. He looked like he was at a loss for a minute before saying,
Hold on to this fence for a second. Don't let go. I don't want you to fall.
Annie took hold of the little fence that separated the walking public from the marble fountain, wondering what Ryan was up to. He glanced around like he was making sure no one was watching, then he vaulted the fence. Annie's mouth dropped open. What are you doing? Ryan grinned, bent his knees, then jumped into the spouting fountain. Holding his arms out, he stood under the spray and let it soak him as Annie watched in shock. Then he vaulted back over the fence and picked up a handful of mud from under the brush. He smeared it across his chest.
Who's the bigger mess now, baby?
A small crowd gathered, and there was a smattering of applause. Ryan smiled at them and bowed at the waist. Annie shook her head and laughed. You're crazy. I can't believe you did that.
I'd do anything for you, Annie. I hope you're not too embarrassed to be seen with me.
Of course not, you goof.
My point exactly.
He put his arm back around her. Wet, soggy, and smiling ear to ear, they headed back to their hotel. They stopped at the front desk on their way in and told them that Annie's purse had been stolen with her room key in it. The girl at the desk apologized profusely, like it was her fault, made Annie a new key, and then comped her $50 in chips and a bottle of champagne that she said would be delivered to her room later that day. Ryan helped her into the elevator, and when they got to her room, he slid in the key and opened the door. When Annie realized he was following her in, she said, "Oh, I'm okay. Thank you, Ryan."
"You're welcome, but I'm not leaving just yet. You go take a shower, and when you get out, I'm going to clean that cut and wrap that knee for you."
"But you need to get out of your wet clothes, too." Ryan closed the door behind him and moved toward the window.
"I'll dry in the sun," he told her with a grin.
"You are so stubborn," Annie said.
"Yep,"
was his only reply. Annie shook her head again and went into the bathroom. Before she closed the door, he said,
"That knee looks pretty bad. Are you sure you don't need me to hold you up in the shower?"
I'm sure." Slowly, Annie shut the door, then leaned against it, willing her heart to stop slamming against the inside of her chest. She would have taken him up on that offer in a heartbeat if she had thought he was serious. When Annie closed the door, Ryan let out the breath he'd been holding since he'd found her lying in that mud. If anything had happened to her. He couldn't bear to imagine it. It was his fault for letting her out of his sight. That wasn't going to happen again while they were here. Ryan picked up the room phone and called the front desk.
"Can I get a first aid kit sent up, please? I'll also need an ace wrap and an ice pack, if you have them."
"Of course, sir. We'll bring those right up." Before Annie got out of the shower, the first aid supplies and the free bottle of champagne had been delivered. She came out in a light cotton robe with wet hair, smelling like a rose garden. Her gaze went to the first aid kit and champagne. Awesome, I could use a glass of that. Of course. Ryan picked up the big magnum of champagne, and as Annie covered her ears, he popped the top. The cork hit the ceiling, and the bubbles rushed out of the top of the bottle and down over Ryan's hand. He poured the bubbly liquid into the 2 glass flutes they'd brought up with the champagne and handed one to Annie. She took it with a shaky hand, and he mentally cursed. She was obviously still upset from having her purse stolen. God, if he could get his hands on the bastard who'd... Annie raised her glass. I'd like to toast to my best friend. Ryan hesitated. He knew he was her best friend. He loved being her best friend. But damn it, every time he heard those words lately, they made him think about what else they could be to each other. To us, he finally said. They clinked their glasses together, then drank. He watched her throat work as she swallowed and barely contained the urge to take the glass from her and taste the champagne directly from her mouth. Whatever was happening with him wasn't good. Instead of fantasizing about kissing Annie, he should be tending to her wounds. With determination, Ryan put down his glass, rubbed his palms together, and said, You do know how lucky you are, right? Lucky? Sure, you have a certified firefighter/paramedic at your disposal. I'm going to fix you up so well you'll never want to go to the doctor again. You'll come straight to me. I'll save a lot of money that way, she said with a laugh. Unless you'll expect compensation. Since I'd never take money from you, I suppose I'll have to think of some other way you can pay me back. Her cheeks heated as she stared at him, and he wanted to kiss his own ass. She'd responded to his sexual innuendo as one would expect, only he shouldn't have made it in the first place. Scoot up there against the headboard. Annie did as she was told, and Ryan sat down next to her with his first aid box and ice pack. He used the hand sanitizer, then put the ice pack beneath her knee and said, Rest your leg on that. Annie let her leg down on the bed on top of the ice pack. Ryan moved his hand, relishing the way her soft skin felt against his fingers. He opened the first aid kit next and found a packet of Neosporin. He opened it and then spread the ointment on a clean, white 2x2 piece of gauze. He pressed it to the cut on her leg and she sucked in a breath. Did I hurt you? He said, worried. No, it just stung a little. It feels fine now. Ryan put a piece of medical tape across the gauze and then took out the ace wrap. I'm going to start near your thigh because I don't want to wrap it too tight on your knee and cut off your circulation, okay? Annie nodded. Ryan took the rolled-up ace wrap and slipped it beneath the lower part of her thigh. His hand trembled when he touched her, and he hoped Annie didn't notice. He felt like a high school kid touching his first girl. He brought the wrap over the top of her leg, tucked it under the other side, then repeated the motions. Annie watched his hands, riveted. Goose flesh scattered across her skin. He wasn't in denial anymore. He knew his touch did something to her, just like touching her did something to him. It wouldn't be smart to do anything about it, yet it took every ounce of willpower he had to resist. Ryan kept treating her leg, moving the ice pack when he reached her knee, then wrapping it until he got to the top of her muscular calf. He was sad to see the end of the roll. Annie had gorgeous legs, lightly toned and smooth. He wanted to explore the patch of skin behind her knee and nibble on her cute little toes. The nails were currently painted a deep purple and reminded him of ripe berries. He settled for securing the wrap with another piece of tape, then slowly sliding his hands down her leg, thigh to calf, as if smoothing down the bandage. Good as new, he told her. She stared at him. Her breath was coming quicker now, and her cheeks were flushed a pretty pink. Thank you, she said, causing his gaze to jerk back up to her face. She drank down the rest of her champagne. You're a good friend. Her hand trembled slightly. Would you like more? She smoothed down her hair. No, I better not stumble into the police station drunk, she said with a smile. Let me fix myself up and I'll be ready to go. Are you going to change? He grinned. Why? Embarrassed to be seen with me now that I'm the only messy one? Never, she said. Besides, the women always did like you wet. Remember how many girls you picked up at the pool the summer before college? I thought you were going to set some kind of world record. He frowned as he watched her walk to the bathroom. Right, Had she deliberately brought up other women because she'd caught him staring at her?
If I recall, plenty of girls flirted with me, but they never stuck around for long once they knew they couldn't compare with my best girl.
She paused at the bathroom door, then looked over her shoulder at him. That's sweet, but you forget the day you ditched me for Angie Florentine the last day the pool was open.
What? I never ditched you.
She smiled almost sadly. Yeah, you did, but it's okay. I've always known how much I mean to you. I'm your best friend, right?
Right,
he said softly. But she'd already walked into the bathroom and shut the door. Chapter 9. After Ryan changed, they took a cab to the police station. On the way, Annie called and canceled her credit cards. She had no money. She didn't even have an ID. Her naughty weekend in Vegas had turned into a disaster. She almost started crying again, but she tamped her emotions down. She wasn't going to wallow in them and let some slime ball ruin her trip. After she finished canceling the last card, she called her sister. Hey, Janie. Hey, sis, what's up? I thought you'd be in Vegas by now. I am, she told her. Then she told Janie what had happened. Don't tell Dad, he'll just worry. Oh man, Annie, I'm so sorry. You're okay though? Yeah, but I need a favor. Sure, anything. I need you to dip into that joint savings account we have and wire me some money. Janie and Annie's grandmother had left them some money that the girls had put into a savings account that either of them could access. They called it rainy day money. This day certainly qualified. Sure, no problem. Where should I send it? Annie told her sister how much she wanted and the name of the hotel to wire it to. Send it to Ryan Hennessy so he can use his ID to pick it up. Wait a minute. Ryan went with you? Her sister knew exactly how Annie felt about her best friend. She constantly urged her to tell Ryan before it was too late and he got serious with someone else. Annie knew exactly what Janie was thinking by the tone of her voice. He sort of invited himself along. Ryan smiled. That's a good sign, Janie said. We'll talk later, she told her sister, unsure if Ryan could hear Janie or not. Right, talk about Ryan later, as usual. Bye, Janie. I love you. Thank you. I love you too. You're welcome. Be safe. I will. Kiss Dad for me. After she hung up, Ryan said, I would have lent you some money. Annie put her hand on his. I know you would have, but you've done enough. You jumped in a freaking fountain, crazy guy, she said, laughing. An hour later, after giving her statement, Annie and Ryan headed back to the hotel. Luckily, the money her sister sent had arrived, so they stopped to pick it up. As they turned away from the counter, Annie ran smack into a wide chest. It felt like hitting a wall. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, she said. The man she'd run into was extremely handsome, with blondish brown hair and light green eyes. He had an elegant build that was still plenty sexy, and his smile was pure bad boy.
It was my fault. I wasn't looking where I was going.
The man turned to look at Ryan and smiled.
Ryan? Max, great to see you. Annie, this is Max Dalton. He and his brother Reese are friends of Jamie Whitcomb's, and now we're friends too. We met at Eric's bachelor party.
Ah, Annie thought about the bachelor party, about how wild it must have been, about how handsome Max was. Not as handsome as Ryan, but given all the hot men at the bachelor party, including Jamie, Cole, Luke, Gabe, and Eric, all friends of Ryan's, the women must have been dropping around them like flies. Nice to meet you, Max.
A pleasure to meet you as well. I'm sorry for being so clumsy. I had my mind on work, and it's been a busy day. Max has the coolest job ever. He's a professional magician, and he just opened a theater. Jamie told us all about it, said it was amazing, and is booked solid for the next few weeks.
That's incredible, Annie said. Congratulations. I've heard about your magic theater. The rumor is it's not to be missed.
Thank you. So what are you two doing here? Sneaking off to the little white wedding chapel, perhaps?
Ryan and Annie both laughed nervously.
We're just on a weekend getaway,
Ryan told him. Max reached into his coat and pulled out 2 tickets. He handed them to Annie and said,
as an apology for my clumsiness. I hope you don't already have plans.
Annie looked at the tickets. They were VIP passes to his magic show that evening. Annie squealed with delight and said, "If I did, I'd cancel them. Thank you so much." Ryan grinned.
"She was just saying how she wanted to see a magic show earlier. You just made her day."
"Great," Max said.
"Will you be able to make it, Ryan?" "Wouldn't miss it." "Then I'll see the two of you tonight. My fiancée, Grace, won't be able to make it, but you'll be sitting with Reese and Melina, and I'll see you after the show."
"I can't wait," Annie told him excitedly. After he walked away, Annie said, "It's funny how one thing leads to another."
"What do you mean?"
Ryan asked her. "Well, if I hadn't gotten mugged, we probably wouldn't be here to bump into your friend Max, and we wouldn't have VIP tickets to a fabulous sold-out show. So I guess that's proof that there's always a reason to be optimistic." Ryan glanced at his watch.
"The show doesn't start for a few hours, but why don't we get ready? We can do a few things beforehand."
They went to their separate rooms to change clothes. Annie unwrapped her legs, smoothed the remaining scrapes with lotion, then chose another new dress that she'd bought specifically for Vegas. This one was a form-fitting jade green mini that covered her breasts completely in front but left her back open to the waist. She wore a pair of sandals with a small heel. She curled her hair along the bottom and let it hang loose around her shoulders. She applied her makeup carefully, adding a touch of purple eyeshadow that made her eyes look slightly golden. She'd just finished getting ready when she heard a knock on her door. Ryan's eyes widened when he saw her.
"Wow, you look amazing, Annie."
She smiled and said, "Thank you, so do you." Ryan was wearing a nice pair of black slacks and a dark blue long-sleeve shirt that looked so soft Annie wanted to touch it. But the truth was she always wanted to touch Ryan. "You want to hit the slots or something?"
"We could do that," he said. "Or we could take a gondola ride at the Venetian. I've always wanted to do that."
"Really? Isn't that supposed to be like for couples or something?"
"It's a ride, that's all. Come on, it'll be fun."
"Okay, then maybe we can hit some slots," she said. "Since we ran into Max, I'm feeling like maybe my luck has changed." Ryan grinned.
"You get to spend the weekend in Vegas with me. How much luckier can you get?"
Oh, there were so many ways. If only he felt something for her besides friendship. They walked down to the Venetian. It was quite a walk, but it put them at the halfway point on the way to their show, and it was a really nice day. They walked through the casino and took the escalators to the second floor. The ceilings were painted and the lighting was soft. It was like being on a romantic street in Venice, strolling along beneath a summer sky dotted with big white puffy clouds. Annie sighed.
"What's wrong?"
"Wrong? Nothing's wrong," she said with a smile. "This is amazing. I've always dreamed of having my honeymoon in Venice."
"With anyone in particular?"
"Just Mr. Perfect," she laughed.
"So me, then."
She looked away, fearing her heart would be in her eyes when he suddenly hooked his arm through hers.
"Come along, Mrs. Hennessy. We've got a honeymoon to enjoy."
They headed toward the ticket booth in the main part of the shopping center. Ryan turned to her and said,
"Would you prefer the indoor or the outdoor ride?"
Annie shrugged. "I've never been on either, so I don't know." Ryan asked the girl in the booth which one was better. "They're both great," she said. "The indoor one is a tiny bit longer, about 5 minutes, I think."
"Okay, I'll take 2 of that one," he told her.
"Private boat or shared?" the girl asked.
"Private," he said with a grin.
The girl gave him the tickets and Ryan took Annie's hand, leading her down another escalator where they got in line for the gondola rides. A boat floated by with an older couple who looked pretty bored. The next one that went by had a younger couple in it. They were locked in a passionate kiss. Annie unwittingly imagined her and Ryan on their real honeymoon. They'd have locked themselves in their honeymoon suite, only coming out long enough to eat, take romantic walks, and then take their gondola ride and listen to the sweet serenade of their boatman. She pictured them sitting in the gondola, her between his legs, leaning her head back against his chest. She imagined his strong arms around her and the brush of his lips against her neck. Once they were back in their room, they would lock in a passionate embrace and,
"Hey, Earth to Annie."
"Oh, shoot, I'm sorry."
"What were you thinking about?"
Ryan asked her. "Just daydreaming," she said, feeling her cheeks heat. "Look, it's our turn. Let's get this honeymoon started." Ryan held her hand as they stepped into the white gondola, carved and lined in gold with intricate detail. They sat closely side by side. The gondolier introduced himself as Marco. He didn't look Italian, but as they started down the canal, he belted out an Italian opera that was so beautiful it almost brought her to tears. As he sang, he rode them through St. Mark's Square, past the lovely shops and cafes under walking bridges where fascinated tourists would stop and listen. Marco's voice was beautiful as he sang in Italian, and Annie's romantic and curious mind couldn't help but wonder what he sang about. She turned toward Ryan, and their thighs brushed. Annie felt a surge of heat ripple through her body. "What do you think he's saying?"
"I know exactly what he's saying."
"Really? So you have a secret ability to understand Italian that you've been hiding from me?"
"Nope, I just know what he's singing about."
"So tell me."
"He's singing about a girl with long, pretty hair with highlights that shine like gold in the moonlight."
Annie grinned and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Go on."
"He says that the reflection of the moon on the water is hardly noticeable because her eyes shine brighter, like precious stones."
Annie closed her eyes, relaxing against him and still smiling. "What else?" Ryan put his lips close to her ear, sending chills running down her spine and arms.
"He's saying she should come lie down with him."
"Why?" Annie breathed out in a whisper of her own.
"She's beautiful, and he wants them to be alone together. He wants to have her all to himself. He wants to make her forget the rest of the world exists."
Annie took a deep breath. What would he do if he had her alone? Lowering his voice even more and speaking even closer so that she could hear him over Marco's sweet crooning, he said,
"He would make such passionate love to her that time would stand still and the world would stop turning."
Slowly, still keeping her eyes closed, Annie turned her face back toward Ryan and pressed her lips to his. The kiss lasted several minutes before Annie pulled back. Ryan looked out of breath, his cheeks flushed. He stared at her, desire and obvious confusion in his eyes. God, of course he was confused. She'd gotten too caught up in the fantasy of being his wife, and that's what she told him, adding an apology.
"Are you sure that's all it was?"
he said in response.
"Getting caught up in a fantasy?"
Annie, embarrassed and appalled that she'd let herself lose control, said, "Of course. What else could it be? You were saying those romantic things, and Marco was singing in his beautiful voice, and like I said, I'm sorry." Ryan cupped her chin in his hand and tilted her face up toward his. He pressed a sweet, close-mouthed kiss on her lips.
"Don't be."
He grinned.
"Too bad, though. That had to be in the top 5 of the best kisses I've ever had."
Annie knew it was silly, but she was disappointed. The top 5 wasn't where she wanted to be. She wanted to be the best he'd ever had, because that's what the kiss had been for her. She cleared her throat and pulled away. Her dress had ridden up her thighs, and she wiggled a little to smooth it back down with shaking, sweaty palms. Ryan watched her, staring at her thighs. She could feel the color rushing to her face, and they experienced the rest of the ride in silence. When it was over and they were back on solid ground, she scrambled for something to say. "So, now that the honeymoon's over, do you want to gamble next?"
"Sure,"
Ryan said.
"Unless you want to hit Madame Tussauds first while we're right here."
Annie looked over and saw that the wax museum was nearby. "Okay, that might be fun," she said. Ryan paid their way again, refusing to take Annie's money. They walked through the Viva Las Vegas room first. They were suddenly amongst the greats who'd shaped the history of Las Vegas: Elvis, the Rat Pack, Liberace. Annie took a picture with the Blue Man Group, and Ryan posed with Celine Dion. The photo would go in the album in which she kept most of her photos of her friends and family. She stored it next to her bed so that if there was ever a fire, she could easily grab it before she ran out of the apartment. They went into the sports zone next.
"You take Muhammad, and I'll step in with Chuck,"
Ryan told her. "Why, do you think I can't handle Chuck Liddell?"
"I'm sure you can handle him,"
Ryan told her with a grin.
"But Ali was the greatest fighter that ever lived,"
he said in a soft, scratchy voice, imitating Ali. Annie grinned back before donning a pair of red gloves the attendant gave her and stepping into the ring with Muhammad Ali. He looked so real right down to his mouth guard. Annie put her glove to the side of his face, and Ryan snapped a photo of her knocking out the greatest. Ryan got into the octagon with Chuck Liddell, and Annie snapped photos, but Annie's favorite part of the sports room was watching Ryan try to go head to chest with Shaquille O'Neal. Ryan tried 3 shots, but Shaq stuffed all 3.
It's rigged,
Ryan told her. Yeah, okay.
I could have had a career in basketball.
If only you had grown a few feet taller, she said with a grin. They moved into the next room. It was full of superheroes. Annie loved superheroes. Ryan teased her about it, but never failed to go to see the newest Marvel Comics movie with her. She made him take pictures of her with almost every character. Spider-Man was her favorite, so she had Ryan take 2 of her with him. Ryan asked a lady behind them if she would take a photo of them both with the Hulk. They got on either side of the massive green beast and did their superhero poses while the lady snapped the picture. When she handed the phone back to Ryan, the woman said, "You are such a cute couple." Annie waited for Ryan to tell her that they weren't a couple, but he didn't. Instead, he thanked her and they moved on to the 4D experience part of the show. They got to watch a really cool 4D superhero show, and before they left, Annie sang for Simon Cowell, who told her she was abominable. It was a great time. I think we took too long in there, Annie told Ryan when they came out. It's almost 7. We better head over to the show now. Maybe we can do some gambling later? Ryan agreed, and they took a cab to the magic show. The theater was all posh dark wood and red and black decor. When Ryan and Annie took their seats, Max and a beautiful brunette sat in the seats beside them. Only Max didn't seem to recognize her.
"Annie," Ryan said. "This is Reese, Max's twin brother, and his wife, Melina. They live here in Vegas. Well, the outskirts."
They both stood.
"So glad you can make it. I was about to get Melina a drink. Would you like one, Annie?"
Sure."
"I'll go with you, Reese."
Ryan leaned down and gave her a kiss on the cheek.
"Be right back."
"So what are you 2 doing in town?" Melina asked. "Just a little vacation," Annie told her. "Do you like living here in Vegas?"
"I really do, actually."
"We don't live near any of this," she said, gesturing around the theater. "The neighborhood we're in is slow-paced and kid-friendly. But it's fun to be so close to all of the action. Besides, this is where Reese needs to be, and I need to be with Reese. If I had to, I'd make the North Pole work." Annie could see the love in the other woman's eyes when she talked about her husband. "So, Ryan and you?" "He's my best friend." Melina nodded. "Reese and I were great friends before we became lovers and then husband and wife. He's still my best friend. I really believe it's where everyone should start." Annie glanced around to make sure that Ryan wasn't nearby. "How do you do that, though? Go from friends to lovers? Weren't you afraid of messing up the friendship?" "Yes," Melina said. "And I'll confess, neither one of us was brave enough to take that risk at first. Someone who loved us knew how we felt and pushed things a little. But once we opened ourselves to the idea, things progressed quite quickly." "And you suddenly knew everything would be okay?" "No, there was no guarantee. But, well, I knew the risk was worth it. I knew Reese was worth it, and here he is now." Annie looked up in time to see Reese approach them, drinks in hand.
"Ryan's right behind me,"
he said.
"Excuse me for popping in and out, but since Max gets to do the magic, I need to make sure everything is running smoothly behind the scenes."
"Don't let him fool you," Melina told Annie. "He's a pretty magical guy himself." Reese kissed his wife on the lips and said,
"That's where I get my magic from, that and the super twins. I'll see you lovely ladies in a bit."
He left to attend to his business, and Annie didn't miss the look of pure adoration in Melina's eyes when she watched him go. "You have twins?" Annie asked.
"Yes, a boy and a girl."
"Aw, that's so cool," Annie said. "I'd love to have babies someday."
"The joy is indescribable," Melina told her. "The joy of what?"
Ryan asked as he walked up.
"Having babies with your best friend," Melina said with a wink in Annie's direction.
She blushed and looked at Ryan, who watched her intently. The magic show was as wonderful as she suspected it would be. Afterward, they had a drink with Max, Reese, and Melina. At one point, Max's fiancée, Grace, stopped by, surprising them. She had a beautiful engagement ring on her finger. They all chatted and laughed, and at one point Annie realized that anyone watching them would think they were 3 couples enjoying a night out on the town. She, however, wasn't part of a couple. She was a big fat fraud, was what she was. Dread filled her lungs, making it difficult to breathe. She had come to Vegas with a specific agenda. Part of that agenda had been to get Ryan out of her system, yet since the moment he'd stepped on the plane in San Francisco, she hadn't been able to concentrate on anything else. As the evening came to an end, Annie thanked Max again for the invitation. "I had an amazing time." Before she left, Melina put a hand on her arm and said, "Don't forget, sweetheart, some risks are worth it. Very, very worth it." She and Ryan got a cab back to the hotel. Ryan was talkative, going on about what a great job Max had done, and even mentioning how awesome it was that Max got to spend his days surrounded by beautiful women. Annie wanted to scream at him, "I got it, we're just friends," but of course she didn't.
"Are we going to hit the slots now?"
Ryan asked as they arrived back at the hotel. "I think I'd like to take a little nap. Maybe we could gamble a little later, after dinner?"
"Are you okay?"
"I'm fine. It's just been a long day," she told him. "I'll see you in an hour or so." Chapter 10. Annie drifted off to sleep, then woke from her nap about an hour later. She called Ryan.
"Hey,"
he said in a sleepy voice. "Did I wake you?"
"Just got up. Did you decide what we're doing tonight?"
"I decided what I'm doing tonight," she told him in a stern voice. "I'm going through with my plan, Ryan." There was silence on the other end of the line. She waited for what seemed like a long time for him to say something. He didn't. "I know you're not happy about the idea. I know you're just worried about me, and I appreciate that. I'm not stupid, though. I'm going to be careful. If you're that worried, you can come with me." He grumbled something that sounded like, "Yeah, okay." Annie wanted a firmer commitment. "Ryan, promise me that if I'm not in clear danger, you'll stay out of it."
"I said yeah,"
he told her. "Promise," she said.
"Okay, Annie, I promise."
His tone was still begrudging, but she knew he wouldn't break a promise to her. "I'll be ready in an hour," she told him. Chapter 11. Almost an hour later, close to 10 p.m., Annie went over to the dresser to put her earrings on. She took one last look at herself in the mirror. Her black dress had a plunging neckline, and each shoulder held 2 thin straps that crisscrossed down her back and attached to the short skirt at the small of her back. The skirt ended just below the tops of her thighs. She wore a new pair of 4-inch black heels and a solitary diamond necklace on a silver chain, which Ryan had given her last Christmas, as well as a pair of matching earrings. Her hair had actually cooperated tonight and lay in soft curls across her shoulders and down her back. She looked good. She looked ready to meet a man and flirt and be as naughty as the next girl. But her heart wasn't in it. For a half-second, she thought about calling Ryan and telling him she was sick. But then someone knocked on her door.
"Annie, you ready?"
he called through the door. She wasn't, but she had to be. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw him. He looked pale, almost queasy. "Wow, do I look that bad?" she asked him. He rolled his eyes.
"You look insanely gorgeous," he told her.
Annie felt her heart speed up in her chest. "Really?"
"Yeah, really,"
he said, moving inside and closing the door behind him. "Then why do you look like you're about to throw up?" He shoved his hands through his hair.
"Geez, Annie, you don't get it, do you? My stomach is in knots thinking about you going through with this."
"Because you're worried about me?" He frowned, pressed his lips together. He looked conflicted, torn. "Ryan?" He raised a hand to cup the back of his neck, heaved out a sigh, and looked at a spot over her shoulder.
"It's hard sometimes, imagining you with another man."
Shock strummed through her. She took a step closer, hand outstretched, but dropped it when he took a step back. His gaze met hers.
"I guess I like being the most important man in your life a little too much." But if this is what you really want, I'll support you the way a friend should.
She felt a tinge of hope at his words, and her body trembled. Hesitantly, she took a step toward him again. This time, he didn't move away. Have you ever imagined us together, Ryan, as more than friends? Lifting a hand, he cupped her cheek.
In the past, sure. But what we have, it's a good thing, Annie. I don't want to mess it up. I can't mess it up.
Dropping his hand, he stepped away from her. Then he did it again. In that moment, with the feel of his touch still burning her flesh but her heart turning to ice, that small distance seemed insurmountable. And you think it would?
Wouldn't it?
He asked, his eyes searching, intense. She opened her mouth, closed it.
Tell me the truth. Is this, your naughty list, what you really want, Annie?
I want... She licked her lips, shook her head. Too much. She wanted too much. She wanted him to be madly and passionately in love with her. He wasn't. End of story. Yes, fulfilling my naughty list is what I want. Who knows? Maybe you'll find a hookup yourself. He continued to stare at her for a minute before shaking his head, not in censure or disappointment, but as if clearing it. Suddenly, he clapped his hands together, the sound making her jump.
You're right. We're in Vegas, baby. Why should you have all the fun?
Ryan threw his arm across her shoulders and led her toward the door. It took everything she had to keep herself from crying. Once in the elevator, Ryan asked her,
So where did you decide to go?
Annie shrugged. I thought since Gillies is right downstairs, we'd try that one first. It's Vegas. We have all night if that one doesn't pan out.
I'm not arguing with any plan that involves hot waitresses and leather bras and chaps.
That comment only served to anger Annie. If he had stayed at home where he was supposed to be, then maybe her head would be on her plan instead of those nice, tight jeans he was wearing. When they got downstairs, Ryan took her hand and led her through the crowded casino and into the bar. The decor was distinctly Western, with a giant Texas Longhorn mechanical bull with padding on its horns in the middle of a padded pit. Loud country music was playing and the dance floor was full. Some of the people in the bar were dressed in boots and jeans, but most of them were dressed in club wear. As Ryan predicted, the cocktail waitresses wore black leather bikinis and chaps, as well as black cowboy hats. To Ryan's credit, he kept his eyes locked on her. He let go of her hand and said,
Okay, I'm in brother mode now. Happy hunting.
The hand he'd been holding felt cold, and all Annie wanted at that moment was for him to touch her again. She started to walk away, but stopped. I've got an idea, she told him. Why don't you dance with me when we get in there? Dance sexy with me, flirty. I don't know why, but people always seem to want women who look like they're already taken, right? Ryan had a look on his face that Annie couldn't quite decipher, but he said,
Yeah, you're right.
Then he retook her hand and led her inside. She relaxed when he touched her again. Ryan led her out to the dance floor and slid his strong, sexy arms around her waist. Annie put her arms around his neck, and with a simple tug, he pulled her body in so that it molded against his. Annie wondered if Ryan could feel her body shaking as they began to move to the soft, slow music coming out of the jukebox. As they danced, Annie felt Ryan slide his mouth up next to her ear. He used it to move her hair, causing a shiver of desire to run down her spine. Next, she felt his hot breath and the vibrations of his sexy voice as he whispered into her ear.
I saw 3 guys nearly fall off their stools when we walked in. I can hardly blame them.
Annie had to really concentrate to be able to get enough air into her lungs to be able to speak. Finally, she was able to say, Are they hot guys? His body tightened.
Hell if I know, he said. But just in case they're to your liking, I'll put on a good show for them.
He swung her around so that her back was facing the bar and she brushed up against his chest. His fingers lightly grazed her left hip, causing her to shiver. She couldn't tell if he noticed her reaction or not, but before she could even consider it, she felt his hands travel slowly around to the small of her back. The rest of the world fell away. She closed her eyes, savoring that additional intimacy. To the curious onlooker, it would appear that they were whispering sexy things back and forth while they danced. He kissed her ear.
They're all watching and imagining it's them holding you.
Swallowing hard, trying to clear the baseball-sized lump from her throat, Annie finally said, it was... Thanks, Ryan.
Anytime, he told her.
He reached up and pushed a loose strand of hair off her face. He tucked it behind her ear, and that simple move felt to Annie like the ultimate act of seduction. I guess we should split up, she said in a shaky voice that begged for him to tell her she was wrong.
Yeah, I guess,
he said. It wasn't what she'd been hoping for.
Be safe, Annie. Don't do anything that you're not 100% sure about, okay?
She only nodded. She was still carrying around that lump, and it threatened to push up and destroy the frail dam holding back her tears. She watched him take a seat at the bar. Following his lead, she did the same, seating herself at the opposite end.
What can I get you?
The bartender asked. A cosmopolitan, she said, having already anticipated she was going to need some alcoholic courage to get through this evening. She glanced down toward Ryan. He already had an admirer sitting next to him, a petite blonde on his right. Ryan had spun his seat so that he was facing the mechanical bull in the center of the bar. The woman was facing Ryan and leaning in way too close.
Hey there.
Annie heard the male voice next to her, but she was too focused on Ryan that she didn't process it at first. She watched as the blonde said something to Ryan, and then she slapped his thigh with her perfectly manicured hand as they laughed. The bartender set her drink on the counter, and that was when she realized there was a man sitting next to her. Startled, she said, "Hi."
"Hey," he said with a grin. "I thought that was gonna be my quickest shutdown ever."
"What?" Annie said, genuinely confused. The man laughed and said,
"I said hello, but you were preoccupied. Bruised my ego, but didn't completely demolish it. Yet. I'm Clint."
Clint was a good-looking guy. He was lanky and tall, probably 6'3" or 6'4", and he had dark hair and big brown eyes with long lashes. He was wearing typical cowboy garb, blue jeans and a black cowboy shirt with black boots and a black felt Stetson. "I'm Annie," she said, forcing a smile. Realizing this might be her chance at a one-night stand, she drew strength from one last glance in Ryan's direction. The blonde was practically in his lap now, and there was a brunette on his other side. Ryan seemed to be flirting with them both. He was clearly moving forward with his plan. She had to move forward with hers. She turned back toward Clint. "You're wearing all black. Does that make you a bad guy?" His smile indicated he was genuinely amused. It softened his features and made him even better looking. He tipped his hat.
"I can be as good or as bad as you want," he said.
Ryan watched Annie talking to the cowboy. Every muscle in his body was taut, his fists clenching, his legs barely able to stay still, given the urge he felt to go to her. Now. No, ever since they'd danced. Ever since they'd walked into the damn bar. Hell, it had taken everything he had to leave their hotel rooms and come down here with her. He didn't want her to be with another man. He wanted her all to himself. Being with her here in Vegas, whether it was eating a damn meal, acting goofy doing tourist stuff, or getting hot and heavy in a gondola, meant more to him than any time he'd ever spent with a woman. He wanted it all. He wanted Annie. And he knew without a shadow of a doubt once she was his, he'd never want to give her up. Why settle for any other woman in the world when he could have his best friend, in his life and in his bed? But that wasn't what Annie wanted. She was across the bar, flirting with another man. With a sigh of defeat, he turned to the blonde beside him. He'd realized too late, if he'd had a chance with her to begin with, that he could commit himself to Annie for an eternity and beyond. And now he had to forget her. Chapter 12. Clint was handsome and funny and sexy. Almost as handsome and funny and sexy as Ryan. The bartender placed a beer in front of Clint, and as he swigged that and she sipped her cosmopolitan, he swiveled his stool around so that they were both facing the mechanical bull arena. He smiled at her and said, "Have you ever ridden one of those?" Annie's eyes widened as she watched the next rider get on the bull. The last one had been sent flying end over end after 5 seconds. "No way," she said.
I used to ride the real ones for a living before I got too old and broken down."
Annie laughed. "Old? You can't even be 30 yet."
"I just turned 30 last month, as a matter of fact," he said, winking at her. "In bull rider years, that's ancient."
"Really? How old were you when you started?" she asked, genuinely interested. At the very least, Clint was taking her mind off Ryan for a few seconds.
"I was about 8 when I started riding the sheep out at my uncle's ranch, mutton busting. I did my first rodeo at 10, and that was getting a bit of a late start. I reckon I've had just about every bone broken in my body at one time or another in my 20-year career. It ain't a comfortable life for a young'un. If I was still doing it, it'd probably kill me. I was always too tall for it, too. My legs took a lot of the beatings."
"So how old were you when you retired?"
27, he told her with a grin. "Early retirement is sweet."
"Wow, so what do you do now?"
"Sit in bars and talk to pretty girls," he said with a laugh. "Can't beat that."
"Nice, but there's got to be more to your story than that. You just don't want to tell me." He was hitting on her, but it wasn't creepy. He was interesting. She liked him. She glanced over at Ryan again. This time he was looking at her and their eyes met. There was something in his expression, like he was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't figure it out. Probably just reminding her telepathically to be careful.
"You're more perceptive than most. I actually own a cattle ranch in Montana now. My brother and I saved all the purses we won in rodeos and later on in the bull riding circuit, and we put it all into cattle and land. I just needed a few days away, so here I am."
"I've always heard that it's beautiful in Montana."
"It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Everything is wide open. I could never live in a place like this, with all these people just stacked on top of one another. But it's fun for some excitement, like meeting gorgeous women like yourself. Where are you from?"
"California," she told him. She glanced down the bar at Ryan again. He laughed at something his companion said.
"Ah, that's too bad."
"I'm sorry, what?" Annie asked. She heard what he said, she just didn't know what he was talking about.
"I had high hopes for you and me getting better acquainted tonight."
"And something changed your mind?" she asked.
"The guy at the end of the bar, the one you keep gazing at."
"Ryan, he's just my friend. I was only making sure his night was going okay, that's all."
He said.
What?" Annie said. The man seemed like he had more to say, and emboldened by the drink she'd had, and probably the champagne she'd had earlier, Annie wanted to know what it was. He took a sip of his beer.
"How long have you been in love with your friend there?"
"What?" Annie tried to laugh, but it came out as just a strange little strangled sound. "He and I have been best friends for years. I'm not in love with him." Clint chuckled.
"You trying to convince me or yourself?"
"Fine." Annie knocked back the rest of her drink, then furrowed her brows. "What makes you think I'm in love with him?" Clint smiled softly, then quietly said,
"Your whole face changes when you look at him. I thought you were the prettiest girl in the room when I first saw you, but when you looked at him, there's nothing prettier than a woman in love."
Annie looked at Ryan again, then back at Clint. There didn't seem to be much reason to go on denying it. Instead, she shrugged. It doesn't matter, he doesn't feel the same.
"You're sure wrong about that, doll."
Annie motioned to the bartender for another drink. "Why would you say that? Can't you see him surrounded by women down there?"
"Yeah, they want him all right."
He nodded to the bartender to bring him another beer as well.
"But you see the way his jaw is clenched? He's talking to them, putting on as good a show as you are. But when you're not looking, he's picturing himself ripping my head right off my shoulders."
Annie glanced down the bar again. Ryan, who'd been looking in her direction, quickly turned away and back toward Blondie. "I honestly don't think so," she said. He admitted he's thought of us hooking up at times, but if he had deep feelings for me, I think he would have said something by now."
"Because you've said something to him about your feelings, right?"
Clint lifted the Cosmo the bartender set down and held it out to her. Then he lifted his beer and did a quick toast.
"Answer me this, beautiful girl in love. What prompted the two of you to come to Vegas together and then sit on separate ends of the bar?"
Annie felt her face go hot. She put her mouth against the rim of her martini glass and sipped long and hard. Her mouth was dry as a bone.
It's okay if you don't want to talk about it, Clint told her.
I'm just a little embarrassed to tell you, she said. If not for the second Cosmo, maybe she never would have said anything. But her inhibitions were just low enough that she suddenly opened her mouth and began to talk about everything. She told him about the list and about Ryan following her to Vegas to protect her. Then she put a hand to her cheek. You probably think I'm pathetic, don't you?
I think you're amazing.
He took another long pull off of his beer.
Has he kissed you yet?
Annie flushed bright red as she thought about the kiss.
Take it from a man who knows the inner workings of another man's stupid brain. He's into you, Annie. And the way he's into you, it's more than occasionally thinking about you two hooking up. He just hasn't admitted it to himself yet.
You really think so? She leaned closer to him, barely whispering the words. Maybe he was right, Annie realized. Ever since Ryan had found her naughty list, there was plenty of evidence to support what Clint was saying. Ryan had kissed her in San Francisco. And that kiss, even as brief and closed-mouthed as it had been so hot, so intense. Then he'd followed her here to Vegas. She'd initiated the kiss on the gondola, but he'd definitely kissed her back. Annie stole a quick glance Ryan's way. The women still looked interested, but Ryan just looked sad. At least it was a step up from how he'd looked when she'd told him she was sticking to her plan, like she'd shoved a knife in his chest. What if Ryan really does have feelings beyond friendship for me? God, if only it were true, she said.
I'd bet my last purse on it, Clint said.
Annie smiled ruefully. Please don't, because even if you're right, even if we're soulmates, I'm obviously a big chicken, and so is he. We have a wonderful friendship. We could lose that if we didn't work out.
Maybe so, Clint said. Or maybe you can just go for it and it will work out.
She imagined throwing herself at Ryan. Imagined him rejecting her, gently, with pity in his eyes. But it would be rejection nonetheless.
You ever hear of a guy named Lane Frost? Clint asked her.
Sounds familiar, she said.
Ever seen the movie 8 Seconds?
Oh yeah, she tapped on his forearm as recognition shot through her brain. Luke Perry played a bull rider who got killed. That movie was so sad.
Yeah, it was. I was a kid when Lane was on the rise, but he was my hero. He used to have a saying that was pretty popular with the rodeo crowd. He'd say, don't be afraid to go after what you want to do and what you want to be, but don't be afraid to be willing to pay the price.
In other words, if it means enough to me to be with Ryan, I'll have to risk losing my friendship with him to make that first move? He tapped his glass against hers again with a clink.
Something like that, darling. You want another drink, or are you going to take some risks?
Would you mind doing me a favor? She said.
Sure. What can I do for you?
Do a shot with me, she said. And make it sexy. I want to see how he reacts. Clint grinned and asked the bartender for 2 tequila shots.
I reckon you're pretty enough to get punched in the face over.
Ryan wouldn't do that, she said.
Never underestimate a man in love, Clint told her as the bartender set up their shots. Is he watching right now? He asked her.
Yeah, he's watching, she said. She caught Ryan's gaze, faked a smile, and gave him a quick thumbs up.
With your permission, ma'am?
Clint held out his hand and she placed her hand in his. She sucked in a breath when he licked her wrist. Grinning, he dashed some salt on her moistened skin, then licked again. He picked up the tequila, downed it, then bit into a lime.
We've got his attention now, pretty girl. Ready to drive him over the edge?
Annie nodded. Knowing she had to go for it, Annie licked Clint's thick wrist, then dashed salt on it. He grinned at her, then put a wedge of lime between his teeth. Taking a deep breath, she licked the salt off his wrist, drained her shot, then leaned in and slowly took the lime from his mouth. Clint resisted a bit, keeping her close for several prolonged seconds. When Annie sat back up and took the lime out of her mouth, she glanced over at Ryan. He looked pissed, stone-faced, lips tight, nostrils flaring.
What did I tell you?
You might be right. You should be charging for your psychic services, she told Clint with a smile.
Ain't no need for a psychic where love is concerned. You just have to know what to look for.
"So, what now?" she said. She was really talking out loud to herself, trying to gather some courage to make her move. "Should I tell him you shot me down?" Clint laughed. "You are something. You don't need my permission for that, but if it'll help you, you go right ahead. It will make me look awfully stupid. I'd have to be crazy to walk away from someone as pretty as you." Annie blushed. "You are a really nice guy. You're handsome, and you know so much about love. Why are you all alone?" With a smile still on his face, he said, "You have enough on your mind tonight, darling. I'm gonna drain this beer and walk away, leaving my reputation in the toilet. I wish you nothing but good." Annie watched him do exactly what he'd said he was going to do, finish his drink, drop enough bills on the counter to cover both of their drinks, then turn and walk away without a backward glance. He was so nice that she had to remind herself to lose the smile and look like she'd just been rejected. She took a deep breath. "One more shot of tequila, please." The bartender promptly poured her another, and she downed it. Then she plastered a sour look on her face and stood just before Ryan appeared by her side. "What's wrong?" She had a good buzz going, so she hoped her words wouldn't slur. "I'm just not good at this. Can you help me back to my room? You can come back down afterwards." Ryan took her hand and led her out of the bar so quickly that Annie almost got dizzy. When they stopped in the elevator, Ryan asked, "What happened? Do you want to talk about it?" Annie forced another sad look and shrugged. "I'm not sure what else to say. I tried so hard with that guy, but he shot me down. I'm just so humiliated." "He had to be crazy or gay," Ryan said. "You were the prettiest woman there." Annie still wasn't ready to come right out and tell him how she felt, but she needed to get him alone. She needed to know if he wanted her as badly as she wanted him. When they got inside her room, she turned to him and said, "You can go back down now. I'm sorry for dragging you away from your admirers." "I don't have any desire to go back down there, Annie. I want to be here with you. I want to make sure you're okay." Annie kicked off her heels and sat on the bed. "Maybe it's not a matter of my looks. Maybe I'm boring. I have no idea how to turn a guy on. I'd probably clear a room during a game of strip poker." Ryan shook his head with a shaky laugh. "Any man would be throwing his auntie down on the table in a heartbeat for an offer like that. Come on, Annie. Don't let one creep get you down." "I'm not. I guess tonight just reminded me how dull I am. I've never played strip poker, and maybe it's because I'm so boring no one ever thinks to suggest it." His face creased with concern. "You're being ridiculous. You're not boring." She peered into his gray-green eyes. "Have you ever played?" He shrugged. "Well, sure, but not lately." "See, everyone's played but me." "Tell you what," Ryan said as he walked to the desk. "How about we play a little game? I'll critique your technique." He pulled out a deck of cards. Annie had to really force herself not to smile now. She was better at this than she'd imagined. But since Ryan was what was motivating her, she shouldn't be so surprised. "Strip poker?" she said, sounding unsure when really she was dying to rip his clothes off. "We've never seen each other naked. Wouldn't it be weird?" "I hardly think we'll be traumatized. You're a nurse, remember?" "Well, yeah, and I suppose you've seen so many naked women there's nothing I have that would make an impression." "You always make an impression on me, Annie." His words made lust and anticipation zing through her. "You won't cheat, will you? I've never played before." Ryan grinned and put his hand over his heart. "No cheating, you have my word." But he held one hand behind his back as he said it. Annie smiled and said, "Let's see the other hand." Ryan pulled it out. His fingers were crossed. He had a silly smile on his face. "It's a good thing I already know how to play poker then," she said. "How many items of clothing do you have on?" he asked. "Do shoes count?" "No." "Then 3, she said. "Damn, you're almost there, and we haven't even started. Let's see, I'm wearing a shirt, pants, boxers, and socks." He bent down, kicked off his shoes, and pulled off his socks. "Now we're even." They both moved to the small dining table and sat across from each other. He started to deal the cards. "So for every hand you lose, you have to take something off, right?" "That's the plan," he said. She picked up the cards Ryan dealt her and tossed 2 aside, face down. Ryan looked at his, grinned, and put one face down on the table.
2?
He asked her. Yes, please, she said.
Okay, and dealer takes 1,
he said. He had a gleam in his eye, and Annie knew he had something good. She laid down her 3 queens. He had a straight flush. You're sure you're not cheating? She said.
Just lucky,
he told her.
Take it off.
Annie stood up and pulled the little black dress over her head. He looked like his eyes were about to pop out of his head, lifted a hand as if to touch her, then quickly dropped it. Ryan dealt them each another 5 cards.
How many?
Ryan asked her. I'm good, she said with a broad grin. Ryan grinned back and said,
Dealer takes 1.
Annie placed her cards down. She had an ace-high flush. Ryan had 2 pair. Strip, she said, feeling more confident all of a sudden. Ryan unbuttoned his shirt and pulled it off. Annie shivered at the sight of his chiseled form. She'd seen his broad, naked chest and the corrugated leanness of his flat abs before, but she hadn't been sitting nearly naked across from him then. He was all rippling muscle, and right now he seemed larger, more dominating. You're stunningly handsome. You're everything. His mouth curved upward.
Careful, or you'll have my head as big as a house.
I wouldn't care. Besides, you're huge all over. He looked at her with a gleam in his eyes, something like predatory intent.
You do know you haven't seen me all over, don't you?
She blushed. It's one of my biggest regrets. He cocked a brow.
Is that so? I'm afraid you've had too much to drink and don't know what you're saying.
I was a little tipsy when we left the bar, but I swear, Ryan, I'm completely sober. I know exactly what I'm saying, and what I want to be doing. But the question is, do you want to keep me at a distance right now? Or will you give yourself to me, Ryan? Truly give yourself to me? His expression grew wary.
Just what are you talking about, Annie? What is it you want from me?
Your heart, your soul, everything you are. Chapter 13. Annie woke up with a smile on her face. She'd had such a nice dream about Ryan last night. A dream in which they'd finally admitted they wanted each other and done something about it. Wow, the way he'd caressed her, talked to her, like she was a woman who drove him crazy with desire. She stretched and rolled over, bumping into something, or someone, as she did. Ryan was on his side, facing her, the sheet pulled up to his waist. Her mind could barely comprehend the sight of all that naked skin and bulging muscle, and she gasped when he opened one eye and grinned.
Wow, that was kind of a rude way to wake someone up.
Oh, damn, I'm sorry, Ryan. Laughing softly, Ryan rolled over onto his back.
What are you sorry for, exactly?
Nothing. I was just startled. Great, Annie, that's just great. You're really messing this up. Recover, fast. I forgot. He raised an eyebrow.
You forgot?
Putting his hand over his heart, he quipped,
Just shove a knife in my chest, why don't you?
That's not what I meant. I didn't forget. I was disoriented. I thought it was a dream.
The best dream I've ever had,
he said, a teasing smile creasing his face. Annie settled on her back next to him. Me too. Ryan was her dream man, the one who made her feel whole and secure and happy. She had no idea where to go from here. Was she supposed to tell him she loved him as more than a friend, or was that totally obvious? Was it too soon to blurt the words out? He wasn't running away. To the contrary, he'd spent the night and he was smiling. He was also acting a little cocky, but neither of them had talked about emotion, love. He leaned in like he was going to kiss her, and she actually yelped as she pulled away. She needed to clean up, gather her courage. Raising another eyebrow, he said,
No morning after kiss?
Turning her head to the side slightly because he was still so close, she said, I'd love one. Let me go brush my teeth first. She jumped out of bed and left Ryan lying there. She closed the bathroom door behind her and stood in front of the mirror. Her hair was a wild mess, and she had never been fond of looking at herself naked, not even after she'd lost the weight. Speaking of which, she reached into the bottom of her makeup case and took out her bottle of diet pills. She shook one out into her hand and swallowed it with a cup of tap water. She put the bottle back underneath her makeup. She didn't want Ryan finding them. He already thought she'd lost too much weight. He would definitely have something to say if he knew she was still taking diet pills to help her along. She picked up her hairbrush and did her best to smooth down her crazy hair. Brushing it only served to make it bigger, frizzier. She made a face and pulled all of it back to the nape of her neck. She wrapped a stretchy band around it and decided that was the best she was going to be able to do at the moment. After emptying her bladder, washing her hands and face, and brushing her teeth, she put on her robe, took a deep breath, and went back into the other room. Ryan was still in the bed, but he'd propped himself up against the headboard with all the pillows.
"Oh, there you are. You were gone so long I thought you might have left," he said with a grin.
"I'm sorry, I was a mess."
"Come here."
He patted the bed next to him. Annie walked over. Then he pressed his lips to hers. He tasted like cinnamon. He must have used the breath spray she'd left on her nightstand. His lips nearly devoured hers, and she moaned and leaned further into him. When Ryan finally broke away, her lips were moist and parted, and she had to suck in a breath before opening her eyes. She looked at him, sure that her complete surrender was reflected in her eyes and splashed across her face in vivid color. "Kiss me again, please," she said in a soft, husky voice. He let out a deep groan and kissed her as hard as the first time. She wrapped her arms around him and returned his kiss with a wild passion that spurred him on. When Annie woke the second time in Ryan's arms, she had a vague memory of him rolling off of her and then snuggling her against him. Annie didn't know how much time had passed this time, but she knew for sure that she needed a shower. She tried to wriggle out of his grasp without waking him, but as soon as she moved, he tightened his grip on her and said,
"Where are you going?"
"To the shower. I'm a mess." Ryan only held on to her that much tighter. She gave in and lay there with him a while longer. When his breathing deepened and turned into a smooth, steady rhythm, she tried to escape again. This time, she made it without waking him up. Annie stood under the warm spray of the shower for a long time, just letting it cascade over her body. Every time she thought about being in Ryan's arms, a smile came to her face. Now that she'd had a taste of Ryan, which had been better than she'd imagined, how would she ever live without him? She was still struggling with what to do next. By the time she'd toweled off, put her wild hair into a neat, tidy French braid, and slipped on a comfortable cotton dress, she'd decided the best thing to do was to take the risk Melina and Clint had encouraged her to take. She was going to tell Ryan how she felt about him. She took a deep breath and pulled open the door.
"I'm starving," he said as soon as he saw her.
She laughed. "Okay, do you want to go eat somewhere, or do you want to do room service?" Ryan pushed himself up off the bed and walked over to her, completely at ease with being naked in front of her. Why wouldn't he be? The guy's bod was breathtaking. He cupped her chin in his hand and tipped her face up toward his. He looked like he had something important to say. She waited several seconds before he finally said,
"Room service, I think. How about you order it while I take a shower?"
Annie released the breath she'd been holding. "Okay, what do you want?" He grinned and looked her up and down.
"One of everything."
Bringing his lips to hers softly, he gave her a gentle kiss and headed for the shower. Annie realized almost a full minute later that she was still standing there with her legs shaking, staring at the bathroom door. He was being so nonchalant and casual that her nerves were getting the best of her. She called for room service, taking Ryan at his word and ordering a lot of food she had no doubt he'd be able to eat. She was dying for a cup of coffee. She could probably eat some toast or some fruit, too. The pill she'd taken earlier had taken away most of her appetite. After she ordered breakfast, she made the bed just to keep busy. With a smile, she shook her head. God, she was so gone for him. There was a knock on the door, and as soon as Ryan heard it, he came out of the bathroom. He took in the food cart with hungry eyes.
"Damn, you really did order one of everything," he said with a smile.
"I aim to please," she said. She gave the young man who delivered their meal a tip, and once he left, she and Ryan each pulled up a chair in the small dining room table. Ryan heaped his plate full of everything, and Annie poured a cup of coffee and buttered a piece of toast. When Ryan realized that was all she planned on eating, he stopped what he was doing and said,
"You're kidding, right?"
"What?" His jaw clenched.
Eat, Annie.
I am eating, Ryan.
A piece of toast and coffee after all that exercise you got last night and this morning? It's not enough to be healthy. You need to stop this diet obsession.
It's not an obsession. It's called discipline. I was tired of being fat, Ryan. I'm close to my goal.
Close to your goal? Please tell me you're not trying to lose more weight, Annie. You look great. Hell, you could stand to put a few pounds back on.
She raised an eyebrow and folded her arms across her chest. I don't think we're going to agree on this one. Can we just agree to disagree and enjoy our breakfast? He hesitated, then nodded before turning his attention back to his meal. After Annie finished her toast, she ate some scrambled eggs just to make him happy. It seemed to satisfy him a little. She cleared her throat. Can we talk about what happened last night and this morning? Ryan looked up at her and shrugged.
Okay.
The shrug made her stomach start to ache, as though the casual gesture indicated how little their time together meant to him. I don't want our friendship to be messed up because of... He put his fork down and reached for her hand. She gave it to him, and he stared at their joined hands for several seconds. He rubbed his thumb against her in soft circles, making her tremble. When he raised his head, however, his expression was tight. His mouth turned down.
Annie, nothing is ever going to make me not want to be your friend. Last night and this morning were amazing, but it doesn't have to change anything with us.
Annie's throat constricted. What was he saying? That even after the pleasure they'd given each other, he wanted things to go back to the way they'd always been? He wanted to remain just friends?
Annie,
he said, looking uncomfortable. Knowing she had to say something, but still feeling off-kilter, she said, I wouldn't know what to do without you. Ryan squeezed her hand.
I think you'd be just fine without me. I mean, you're the brains of our friendship, and the looks, and even the heart. I'd be the one missing a limb without you.
That last part was sweet, but then again, Ryan always built Annie up. He didn't necessarily tear himself down while he did it, but he didn't give himself the credit that he was due either. You have brains, you're gorgeous, and you have a good heart too, Ryan. Don't give me all the credit for our friendship and none to yourself. We've known each other for such a long time that I think both of us would be lost without the other. I don't want to find out. I care too much about you. Ryan brought her hand to his lips and kissed it.
I'm always going to be here for you, Annie. I will never let you be alone. I'll never let anyone hurt you. You're the best thing in my life, and I meant what I said earlier. I wish you could see yourself through my eyes. If you really knew how truly amazing you are, you probably wouldn't want anything to do with me.
That would never happen, she said, frowning. Thank you for the compliment, though. It's good for the ego.
It's the truth. You have no idea how beautiful you are, inside and out. That's my biggest issue with you going out and picking up a strange guy. Why you're doing it. The fact that you think you have to be someone different. I don't want you to ever sell yourself short. Someday you'll meet the man you're meant to be with.
He was looking at her with such warmth in his eyes, but Annie went cold. He'd made love to her with such passion, yet apparently the idea of her meeting Mr. Right, Mr. Not Him, didn't bother him in the least. Annie thought about what Melina had said about taking a risk. She needed to admit that she loved him and had for a long time. She needed to tell him about this trip and how it was supposed to make her forget about him and be able to move on because the pain of not being with him was too much to bear. She needed to tell him that she didn't really want to move on from him, but rather wanted to move on with him. She opened her mouth, yet the words wouldn't come. They were right there, on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't get them out. She was too scared. Ryan looked at his watch.
I forgot to tell you that before we went out last night, Reese called. I told him I'd help him and Melina for a bit today.
Oh, she cleared her throat. What are you helping them do?
Reese had some smoke detectors replaced in his house, and they keep alarming at all hours of the day and night for no reason. He called the company, and they said they'd send someone out this week, but in the meantime, they keep scaring Melina and waking the babies. He just mentioned it the other night in passing, but he said they took the batteries out to get them to stop. That's not safe. They have 2 babies and a giant house. I volunteered to look at them.
That was really sweet of you.
Want to come with me? Reese said Melina and the babies are visiting her mother today, so she won't be there.
She did want to go with him, but she needed time away from him, time to sort things out, to gather the courage to finally say what she needed to say, no matter the outcome. You know, I have some final things I need to do here in Vegas, including calling the DMV about a temporary ID so I can get on the plane tomorrow night. Why don't we meet up later for drinks at Gilly's?
Sounds good. I'll call you and let you know when we're about done. Be careful, okay? Stay in areas where there are a lot of people.
I'll be fine, she said with a smile. I promise. And she would. They had taken a huge step last night and this morning, but they were still friends. After she talked to Ryan, if all he wanted to be was her friend, she'd still count herself a lucky person for the experience they'd shared. But after Ryan left, and the more she replayed their time together, the more confident she became that they could have their friendship and so much more. That Ryan wanted the same thing she did. Physical intimacy, passion, love, the whole shebang. It was a glorious, hopeful feeling. One she was determined to hold on to. Chapter 14. After Ryan left, Annie shoved her money, phone, and credit card into her pocket and went outside to wander around a little. She wanted to check out the tattoo shop she'd researched and then go over to Circus Circus to catch one of its midday shows. After leaving her hotel, she stopped at Starbucks and got a latte. There was a handsome man in a business suit sitting at one of the tables. He looked her up and down, but not in a creepy way, and smiled. She smiled back. She hadn't put much effort into her appearance before leaving, but she suspected she was glowing, radiating happiness. Even though she hadn't told Ryan how she felt, she was still riding the high of their time together, and feeling hopeful that he felt more for her than she'd thought. He had to. The way he'd touched her, the way he'd looked at her, all suggested their time together had been more than just casual sex. Practically skipping, she got her coffee and continued heading down the strip until she reached the little strip mall where the tattoo parlor was located. She peeked through the large glass windows. All she could really see was the counter and the two college-age girls sitting in the chairs next to it. There were pictures on the wall with prices underneath and a sign in the window that said the parlor had recently passed a health inspection. That had been one of the biggest reasons Annie had picked this place out when she'd researched tattoo parlors online. It had been in operation since the late 80s and had never received a poor rating from the health inspector. Another sign said that the artist could do custom designs. That got her thinking about her design and how she might like to change it. She continued on down to Circus Circus, making it in time for one of the acrobat shows to start. While she watched the show, she couldn't help but notice all the children. She felt a pang in her chest and realized that it was her biological clock calling out to her. She wanted a family. No, she wanted a family with Ryan. Although it wasn't the first time she'd thought the thought, it was the first time she'd allowed herself to feel a flutter of hope for the possibility. She finished watching the show and played the slots for a while. Then she went into Vince Neil's restaurant and had an awesome burger on a jalapeno roll. She didn't even worry about the calories, finally taking to heart Ryan's assurances that he thought she was beautiful whether she was 30 pounds heavier or not. The burger tasted amazing. By the time she finished her delicious lunch, she figured she should head back. She wanted to freshen up before she met Ryan in the bar. Annie was showered, shampooed, and shining by the time Ryan called her cell. She wore a new pair of skinny jeans with bling on the pockets, a red satin cowgirl-cut short-sleeved shirt, and a pair of black and red wedge sandals that topped it all off. She felt pretty, and she could already envision the approving look on Ryan's face when he saw her. "Hey," she said when she picked up the call.
"Hey, I'm finished fixing the smoke alarms. Reese's family is safe once more."
"Super Hennessy to the rescue."
"Got that right, baby."
He sounded happy, and she couldn't help thinking he was happy for the same reason she was, because of the new turn their relationship had taken. "Are you on your way back?" she asked.
"I'm already back," he said. "I went by your room and you weren't there, so I showered and changed. Then you still weren't there, so I came down to see if you were at the bar, and I had a drink. I hope you don't mind."
"Of course not. I'll be right down." As she left her room and made her way to Gilly's, Annie mentally practiced telling Ryan everything she'd been longing to tell him. She decided she'd ask him to dance first. When they were in each other's arms, she'd confess how much she loved him, how she wanted to be with him in every sense of the word after they left Vegas. In her fantasy, he would whisper back that he felt the same way, and then they would kiss. She was smiling when she walked into the bar, but her smile faded when she saw Ryan. A jab of pain knifed through her. He was sitting at the bar talking to a gorgeous woman standing beside him, her hand on his arm. Annie's first impulse was to turn around and leave, but no, Ryan wasn't doing anything wrong. He was only talking to another woman. As usual, she was catastrophizing things in her head. Those fantasies she'd been having about her and Ryan could be reality, but not if she bolted every time a beautiful woman spoke to him. She took a deep breath and made her way over to them. Just before she got there, Ryan looked up at her. His expression brightened when he saw her, and he smiled. That did her heart good. "Hi there," she said, stepping up to him. The woman turned and took her hand off Ryan's arm. "That's right," Annie thought. "He's mine, lady."
"Hey, there you are," Ryan said. "Annie, this is Monica. Monica, this is Annie. She's the friend I was telling you about."
Annie frowned slightly. Was it her imagination, or had Ryan put emphasis on the word friend when he'd introduced her?
"Hi," Monica said, holding out her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you."
Annie shook her hand gently and said hello back, but couldn't quite bring herself to repeat the woman's other words.
"Ryan's spoken very highly of you for years," Monica said.
She and Ryan had known each other for years? Suddenly it came to her. Ryan had mentioned a Monica before. She was the wife of one of Ryan's captains. A couple of years ago, he'd had a crush on her. He'd gone on and on about what a great lady she was and how beautiful she was and how her husband treated her like shit. Ryan hadn't believed her husband deserved her.
"If she was mine, I'd treat her right," he'd said more than once.
Of course, she'd hated it when he'd talked about her. Each word had been like a punch in the face. Annie's eyes scanned the bar for the woman's husband. She'd met him only once, but she'd probably recognize him. Her gaze darted around, but she didn't see anyone familiar. Ryan turned to her then and said,
"Monica used to teach the first aid and CPR classes at the station. The classes haven't been the same since she left. We have to deal with Captain Greer now."
Monica laughed.
"He's the one who always smells like Oreos, isn't he?"
"Yes," Ryan said, grinning widely.
"I used to love Oreos, but now I can't eat one without thinking of him."
Annie laughed weakly, but only because Ryan and Monica were. When they were done, she turned to Monica and said, "You're married to the captain who retired last year, Captain Johnson, right?" Monica's expression flickered. She glanced at Ryan, then back to Annie.
"I was just telling Ryan that Blake and I have been divorced for almost 6 months now. I'm celebrating a friend's birthday. They all ditched me for the strip show, though. I wasn't really feeling up to it."
Annie felt her face go pale. Monica was divorced? Monica understood Annie's silence.
"Don't feel bad for asking, please. I'm happy about the divorce. It could be the best thing that ever happened to me."
She cast another glance at Ryan, who was looking at her with... what? Approval? Excitement? Hope? "Well, I'm glad you're happy," Annie said, not knowing what else to say. She sat down next to Ryan, noting that Monica sat on the bar stool on his other side.
"What do you want to drink?"
Ryan asked Annie. "A margarita sounds great," she said, but she could hear the lack of enthusiasm in her own voice. She suddenly felt like a third wheel. This wasn't turning out the way she'd been hoping at all. She knew it made her less than nice, but she wanted Monica gone. After Ryan made sure Annie had her drink, he and Monica chatted about people at the fire station and what they'd all been up to. Annie sipped her margarita and wondered if Ryan was wishing she wasn't there. He finally had an opportunity to make his move with Monica, and Annie was probably screwing that up for him.
"Dance with me, Ryan," Annie heard Monica say. "Thanks, but I don't want to leave Annie."
Ryan immediately looked at Annie, but it was like he was asking her permission with his eyes. "No," she wanted to say, "don't dance with her, dance with me." Instead, she forced herself to smile and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Her heart physically hurt, but she would always be, first and foremost, Ryan's friend. She wanted him to be happy, not feel obligated to sit with her. Maybe the way to accomplish that would be to let him have his shot with Monica.
"Be right back,"
Ryan said as he leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. Annie felt a warm glow rush through her body. Maybe their time together as more than friends was over. He'd wanted her, but now he'd had her. Plus, he'd helped her check an item on her list. Talk about killing two birds with one stone. Now he was probably ready to move on. Her heart sank. She watched as Monica and Ryan danced together, tears burning in the back of her eyes. They looked great together, like the perfect couple. When the song was over, he did his best to divide his time between her and Monica, but Annie knew he was only being kind. He even asked her to dance a couple of times, but she passed. She'd imagined telling him how she felt about him on the dance floor, and now that just didn't seem like the thing to do.
"So, Ryan,"
Monica said,
"I heard through the grapevine that you've been offered a job as a smoke jumper in Northern California. You going to take it?"
Annie had been looking at Ryan, but at Monica's words, her eyes widened. She looked at Monica, then back at Ryan. Ryan looked guilty. "Ryan?" she whispered.
"I was going to tell you, I just haven't had the chance."
"When did you get the offer?"
"On Friday."
3 days ago. And they'd spent practically that entire time together. And yet he hadn't told her anything about it. Why? She closed her eyes briefly. The answer was obvious. "You're going to take it, aren't you?"
"I haven't made up my mind, but I've been seriously considering it, yes."
As he stared at her, she imagined he could see how sick she felt at the idea. He was going to move away. Despite all he'd said about not being able to live without her, maybe their friendship hadn't been worth protecting anymore. Ryan turned to Monica.
"I'm sorry, Monica, but Annie and I need some time to talk privately. Would you mind?"
Annie stood. "No, it's okay. Don't be silly. I'm just surprised. But you know what? I'm also tired. I'm going to go up to my room." Ryan stood as well.
"I'll go with you."
"No, you stay here." She glanced at Monica. "You two have fun."
"Annie."
She turned and took several steps. Then she froze when she saw a bald head and familiar face. The shock managed to seep through her despair. "Oh my God, that's the guy who stole my purse." The man was standing about 6 feet from them, and his head snapped up when he heard Annie. He stared at her a moment, then took off running toward the door. "Bastard," Ryan clipped out just before he chased after him. "Ryan, no!" Annie shouted. Monica's hand was suddenly on her arm. "Come on," the other woman said. The two women, as well as a good deal of the bar's clientele, raced out after them. By the time they reached the street, Ryan had caught up with the thief. Ryan had hold of the guy's arm, and the guy shrugged him off. Both men had their fists clenched.
"I don't know what she's talking about. I didn't take nothing." "Tell it to the police after you give her things back." "I'm not giving anything to that bitch," the other man sneered. Ryan's face turned red and his nostrils flared. "Oh God," Annie said, knowing what was going to happen before it actually did. Ryan pulled back his fist and punched the guy in the face. The thief hit the ground before scrambling to his feet. He tried to take off running, but Ryan was quick. He punched the guy again, and that one knocked him to the ground, and he stayed there. Ryan bent down, grabbed the thief by his shirt, and said something to him that they couldn't hear. The guy looked freaked, but he nodded. A tall, heavy-muscled man in khakis and a polo walked up to Ryan. "I called the police, man. I'm an off-duty cop, and I can detain him until they come."
But Ryan didn't let the thief go. Annie stepped forward to go to him, but before she could, Monica was by his side.
"Ryan, let him go," she said. "I know he hurt your friend and you're protective of her, but let the cops handle it."
She cupped Ryan's face and turned his head toward her. Then, unbelievably, she kissed his mouth. Annie couldn't stand it anymore. She looked away, and that's when she saw yet another familiar face in the crowd. Clint. "Clint," she called. She strode up to him.
"Hey there,"
he said.
"A lot of excitement tonight, huh?"
She looked at Ryan and Monica. He'd let go of the thief. Monica had grabbed his hand, and Ryan was turned toward her and Clint, frowning. She turned back to Clint. "I had my purse stolen yesterday. That was the guy who stole it. I just happened to look up and see him."
"And that just happens to be the guy you love who beat the crap out of him?"
Clint said with a grin.
"And they say chivalry is dead."
Annie nodded, then shook her head and gestured toward Monica. "Yes, No, I mean, that's the woman Ryan's interested in. Clint looked past her.
Nah, he's not even paying attention to her. He can't take his eyes off you.
She wanted to turn back to see if that was true, but she was afraid Clint was wrong. She suddenly didn't feel strong enough to face Ryan and the beautiful woman by his side. She needed to be alone. She needed to think. Can we leave? Together, I mean? He glanced at Ryan again.
You sure you want to do that?
He's had a crush on that woman for years. She was married then, now she's not. As his friend, I need to give him his shot.
But, darling...
She grabbed onto Clint's arm. Please, just get me out of here. A part of her wondered if she was being irrational. But all she kept seeing was Ryan dancing with Monica, Ryan kissing Monica, and most of all, Ryan walking away from her to take a job he hadn't even told her he'd been offered. She'd already been losing him. She just hadn't known it.
I have tickets to a calf roping show over at South Point. It starts in half an hour, if you want to go.
Yes, she said quickly, lacing her arm through his so she wouldn't collapse with grief. I want to go, I really do.
Annie?
Ryan strode up to them. A quick glance behind him showed that the cops were handcuffing the thief. She looked around, but she didn't see Monica. Hi, she said. She almost put her hand on his cheek the way Monica had, but stopped herself just in time. Are you okay?
Yes, the cops have your report. They just need you to make a positive ID, and then they'll question him about your purse and notify you if they're able to retrieve it.
Oh, okay. She turned to Clint. I'll be right back. She talked briefly to the police, who took her statement. Then she turned back to Ryan. Thank you for sticking up for me. You're a good friend. You always have been. He shook his head, a line forming between his brows.
We need to talk. Let's go back inside and...
No, thank you, she said. I'm taking off.
What?
She cocked her head in Clint's direction. Turns out you're an excellent wingman. I ran into Clint again, and he wants to pick up where we left off last night. So we'll let you do your thing, and I'll do mine. Ryan scowled.
You're going with him?
Sure. You have Monica now, and I
don't have Monica. We just ran into each other. Is this because of the job offer? You're pissed I didn't tell you? Because I was going to, Annie, I swear. It's just with everything going on this weekend, everything that's been going on with you.
It's okay, Ryan, I understand. I've caused you enough problems.
Problems? That's not what I meant.
He took her arm and urged her a few feet away so that they could have some privacy.
Listen to me, last night was amazing. I don't want you thinking I want to be with Monica, not you, because that's not true.
Her heart expanded with hope. He looked and sounded like he meant that. But she was scared. Scared that he'd say anything to protect her feelings. Yes, he might be attracted to her, but he'd been attracted to Monica too. She didn't want him passing up his chance with her and then later resenting Annie for it. It was amazing, she said. I wouldn't trade 1 second of last night and this morning for anything. But you've had a crush on Monica for years. She was never available, but now she is. I see how she looks at you, Ryan. If I kept you from your chance with her, you'd end up hating me. As if he didn't hear her plea, he shot Clint a dirty look.
Is this really about Monica and wanting to protect me, or is this more bullshit about your list? Maybe hooking up with your best friend isn't naughty enough, so you're ready to move on to something bigger and badder?
Wanting to be more adventurous isn't bullshit, Ryan.
Doing it the way you planned sure is. I'm not...
Ryan, are you ready to go back inside? Monica walked up to them, smiling. Annie had thought she'd left, that Ryan had sent her away, but obviously that wasn't the case.
No, Monica, Annie and I... Clint suddenly appeared. Annie, the show starts in a few minutes. If you don't want to come...
No, I do. She looked back at Ryan. It's okay, Ryan. You and Monica spend some time together, and we'll catch up later, okay? Ryan caught her arm again.
Don't do this, Annie, he said.
Instead of pulling away from him, she stepped closer, kissed his cheek, and whispered in his ear, I'll always be your friend, Ryan, I promise. No matter what you choose. Don't let me hold you back from the job or anything else. Then she did step back, gently pulling her arm out of his grip. He frowned at her, and with her heart breaking, she turned away. Chapter 15. Annie and Clint took a cab to South Point Arena and Equestrian Center. The exhibit hall was huge, and the hotel and casino that surrounded it were beautiful. When they walked into the arena, there were rows of concession and souvenir stands. The place was buzzing, full of cowboy hats and boots, both male and female.
This place also has a movie cinema and bowling alley. I try to stay here when I come to town, but it was booked this time.
Annie nodded but didn't respond. She hadn't said much since they'd left Ryan. It was hard to talk when her heart was in her throat. She had no one to blame but herself. She'd left Ryan alone with Monica, even though he'd told her he'd rather be with her. But she'd been so scared that he was just saying that to be a good friend, so scared by her feelings for him and her fear that she was losing him because of his job offer that she'd turned coward and run. Now she was having second thoughts, and thirds. She was ashamed of herself. Hadn't Melina and Clint told her that she needed to fight for what she wanted? She didn't want anything as much as she wanted Ryan. He was the love of her life. Yet even after the amazing time they'd spent in each other's arms, all it had taken was a beautiful woman making a move on him and she'd caved, been the same old Annie. She could transform herself physically all she wanted, but deep inside she was the same coward she'd always been.
I probably should have asked you this earlier, but you aren't one of those animal rights activists, are you?
Clint asked, jarring Annie out of her thoughts. Annie blinked. I'm not a member of PETA or anything, but I love animals. Why?
The activists have been against calf roping for years.
How does it work exactly?
The calves are lined up back there,
he said, pointing toward a narrow chute with a door.
When the calf enters the chute, the door is closed behind it, and a little trip lever is fastened around the calf's neck.
Around his neck? Like a noose? She said, sounding as horrified as she felt.
Clint laughed. No, honey, not like a noose. It's a real lightweight rope, and it's attached so that when it's pulled on, the spring-loaded door in front of the roper will open and the rope will fall away.
Why can't someone else just open the door?
It's set up like that to make sure the calf gets a head start. When the roper is ready, he calls for the calf. The guy operating the chute lets the calf out. The calf will run in a straight line, and when the trip runs out of slack, it falls off the calf. That makes the barrier for the horse and rider open up.
What do they do to him when they catch him? She asked.
Wouldn't you rather just watch? It's gonna start here in a few.
I'd rather know what I'm getting myself into, she said. With a grin, Clint said,
Well, the rider has to lasso the calf on horseback, and once the rope's around its neck, he dismounts, picks up the calf, and flips him. Gently, of course,
he added, probably because of her wide eyes.
He flips him gently onto his side and ties 3 of his legs together. When he's done, he throws his hands in the air, and after the timer runs for 6 seconds to make sure the calf doesn't get loose, the time is recorded.
What's a good time?
Well, most of them can do it in about 7 seconds. The world record is just over 6.
She said. None of that sounds very gentle. Once the event got underway, Annie's worries were confirmed. She was too concerned about the animals to enjoy the sport. After the first round, Clint stood up and held out his hand.
Come on, pretty lady. Let's get you out of here.
He was right. She needed to leave. But Annie shook her head. You stay. I don't want to ruin your night. She gave him a quick hug. Besides, there's something I need to do. He smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes.
Something having to do with your friend?
In a way, but mostly just for me. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. I came to Vegas for an adventure. This will be my last one, and I need to do it on my own.
All right, he said. But will you do me a favor? Take my number and give me a text when you're back to your hotel, just so I know you got back safely.
You're a good guy, Clint.
Yeah, that's mostly my problem.
He gave her a soft kiss on the forehead, and then she programmed his number into her phone. Annie made her way outside. No matter what happened, she was ready to be the confident woman she'd always wanted to be. That meant telling Ryan how she felt in a way that couldn't possibly be misconstrued or denied. Annie texted Clint as soon as she got back to the hotel. Back safe.
Good. Thank you for hanging out with me tonight. How did your final adventure go?
Great, but the final outcome is still uncertain.
Good luck.
Thank you for teaching me about calf roping. I'll be joining PETA now. and I'm ready to take a risk."
"You've inspired me to take some risks too, pretty girl. And not in the bullpen."
She flipped her phone shut. What a great guy. Hopefully he'd find someone who deserved him. She rode the elevator up to her room and showered. Before she dressed, she peeled off the small bandage that covered her new tattoo and used a hand mirror to look at her lower back from various angles. She loved it, especially with the changes she had decided to make. A part of her regretted that most people would never be able to see it, but another part of her was glad that it would be her private reminder of the man she would always love, whether he was her friend or something more. She replaced the bandage, glad she wasn't as sore as she'd thought she'd be. The only part that had really hurt was when the tattoo artist had colored in the flowers. A young woman had done the flower, but the big guy at the counter had drawn the initials in. She'd been amazed that someone so big and brawny could do such delicate scroll work. She'd order some room service before calling Ryan. Maybe even order a glass of wine for courage. She was looking through the room service menus when her phone bleeped with an incoming text.
"Don't sleep with the cowboy, Annie, please."
After a brief hesitation, she typed, "Why shouldn't I?"
"You'll regret it. That's not who you are."
"Who am I?"
"Sweet. Amazing."
But he didn't stop there. Each new text popped up in quick succession.
"Beautiful. Kind. Gorgeous. A true friend. The best lover. Sexy. Passionate. Delicious."
The words kept coming, bringing tears to her eyes. She ran her fingers across her phone pad to type a message back. "I sound pretty awesome. I think I'm finally starting to believe it. I'm sorry I left. I was jealous of Monica."
"Like I said, I don't want Monica. I want you."
She sighed in relief. She hadn't blown it with Ryan. A relationship like theirs couldn't be broken by misunderstandings. Their love was deeper than that, permanent. Quickly, she typed in a response. "Come to my room. I need you."
"I'm already here."
Her breath caught in her throat as she dashed to open the door. And he was there, his beautiful face tight with worry.
"You left me,"
he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Clint took me to watch calf roping." His eyes widened and he laughed.
"Seriously? I would think you'd hate that."
"You're right, I left early. I needed to finish my list." His brows furrowed.
"What do you mean by that?"
The corners of her mouth turned upward. "I went to get my tattoo." Ryan's scowl deepened.
"The cowboy went with you to get the tattoo?"
He looked almost as hurt as he would have been if she and Clint had slept together. "No, I went by myself."
"Did it hurt?"
"A little," she told him. "But sometimes you need to go through a little pain if it means finally getting what you want."
"Can I see it?"
Annie knew if she showed it to him, there would be no turning back. Ryan's initials were inside the peony, mixed together with hers. The artist had done an amazing job of crafting the 4 letters to look like a perfect little heart. She hoped he understood what it meant. He was a part of her. He was in her heart, for always and forever.
"Annie?"
Slowly, Annie pulled up her shirt and turned around. She felt Ryan delicately remove the tape that held the bandage in place, then waited as he examined the tattoo. She tried to be patient, but the waiting was torture. If her heart was going to be left bloody and battered, she'd rather get on with it. He sucked in an audible breath, then didn't move for several minutes. Finally, he replaced the tape. He swept her hair over her shoulder so he could kiss her neck. Then he wrapped his arms around her waist, curling himself around her and burying his face in her neck. He held her like that for several long minutes before kissing her neck again and pulling away. Taking her arm, he gently turned her to face him.
"I'm speechless. There aren't words that can describe how I'm feeling,"
he said. Annie was shaking and tears burned her eyes. No matter what happened, she knew she'd done the right thing. She'd been brave. She'd taken the risk. But that didn't mean Ryan was in love with her the way she was with him. "You don't have to say anything, Ryan. I love you. I've been in love with you since we were 16 and I've been too scared to tell you. But that's my problem to deal with, not yours. I'm so blessed to have you in my life, to have you as my friend."
"I love you too."
He gripped her arms gently.
"I always have."
Her mouth trembled and her voice cracked with emotion. Really?
Yes, but baby, you deserve so much more than I can ever give you.
What are you talking about? Annie was genuinely confused. How could this amazing man who was everything to her possibly think that? His gaze darted away and back before he made a sweeping motion toward her.
Look at you. You're gorgeous, and you've always been gorgeous. I can't even tell you how many cold showers I've had to take over the years. You're so smart. I can't begin to keep up with you there. You radiate this goodness from the inside. And about your naughty list, it's true, I didn't want you doing anything you'd regret, but mostly I was jealous. I couldn't stand the idea of you being with someone else. Not that way.
But I've had relationships, dated, we both have, and you never said anything before.
When you were in a relationship, I could convince myself those men had more to offer you than I do.
Annie cupped the side of his face. I never told you how I felt either. How smart does that make me? I've been an idiot. I should have risked putting my feelings out there a long time ago. But yeah, of the two of us, you're most definitely the crazy one. Ryan laughed and said,
Thanks. That's what every guy who tells a woman he loves her wants to hear.
His expression turned solemn.
And I do love you, Annie, in every sense of the word.
I love you, and you're amazing, amazingly smart. If anyone thinks that being a firefighter is all about muscle and not about intelligence too, they're crazy. That means you're crazy. How many medical calls do you respond to each day? How many different types of chemicals do you have to understand to fight different fires? You and I have always been able to talk about anything and everything intelligently. When you were 16, you didn't need a tutor. What you needed was a vacuum. You couldn't keep your mind on your schoolwork because you were too busy thinking about girls and football and girls.
Thinking about you. About how much I wanted you,
he said, then covered her mouth with his. Annie kissed him back, and for the first time she poured all her love into the kiss. When they finally came up for air, she had tears in her eyes again, but this time in a good way.
I upset you.
Annie laughed through her tears and said, These are happy tears. I was so afraid you'd choose Monica. I didn't want to lose you. I can't imagine life without you.
You don't have to, and I'll prove it to you, starting by getting my own tattoo.
She laughed and pressed her mouth to his. Annie wasn't sure if she'd ever get used to kissing him. Ryan moved with her, and the result was blissful, sweet, and incredibly amazing. He pressed in close, delighting her with the hard pressure of his body as they kissed. Ryan ran his tongue along her bottom lip, then pulled back and looked at her with those piercing gray-green eyes that she loved so much.
You taste as sweet as you look and feel, he told her. You are so beautiful. Last night was incredible. But last night I wasn't sure if you wanted more than fun. I want to do it right.
I'm not sure if I can stand anything better than last night or this morning. Security might come busting in.
Let 'em come, he said with a grin as he led her over to the bed.
Annie laughed, but that laughter faded when he cupped her face in his hands.
There will never come a time in my life when I don't want you to be a part of it. You can't get rid of me, ever.
He rested his forehead on hers.
You're mine, and I'm yours.
Then he pressed his mouth against her once more. Afterward, as Annie lay listening to Ryan's even breathing, her last thought before sleep took her was she didn't need to fantasize anymore. Their forever had just begun. Epilogue. 6 months later. Christmas. For real. Annie checked on the turkey in the oven, then glanced at the clock. Ryan would be here any minute, and she couldn't contain her excitement. It had been 2 weeks since she'd last seen him, but it had felt like an eternity. When they'd returned from Vegas, he'd accepted the smoke jumper job, and a month later, he'd moved to Northern California. He was happier than she'd ever seen him, but of course she liked to think that was because they were finally together and not just because of his new job. After all, she was just as happy, and she was now unemployed. She was also 10 pounds heavier than she'd been in Vegas. She'd flushed the rest of her diet pills after realizing she'd taken the weight loss thing a little too far. The real transformation she'd needed had been on the inside, by discovering who she was and not being afraid to show people. Now she still ate sensibly and exercised often, but only because she felt healthier. She allowed herself to indulge in her favorite foods again. And while there would be days where insecurity sneaked in, she was comfortable with herself, inside and out.
"Honey, I'm home,"
she heard Ryan call out as he let himself into the apartment. Annie ran to greet him. He opened his arms as soon as he saw her, and she jumped into them, wrapping her legs around his waist. He squeezed her until she could hardly breathe, and then he kissed her, taking away what little breath she had left.
"I missed you,"
he said when they broke the kiss. She said with a smile, still reeling from the kiss. "I missed you too." Ryan set her on her feet and looked around the apartment. After they'd returned from Vegas, Annie had hung up all her old pictures again. Annie's favorite photo at the moment was one of her and Ryan in front of the Bellagio fountains. It had been taken the night she and Ryan had begun making the concrete plans that would take them from friends to committed lovers. Interspersed among all the other photos were newer ones, too, many taken at his new place in Northern California, where Annie visited him every chance she got.
"It looks like Christmas," he said. "And it smells like Christmas. I wasn't even hungry until I walked in here."
"You better be hungry," she told him. "The turkey is big enough for a small army." Wrapping his arm around her waist again, he said,
"So, do you miss your job yet?"
Annie shook her head. "I'll miss my coworkers and the regular patients who we see all the time, but I can't wait to be in a place where I get to come home to you every night."
Good answer.
For the past 6 months, Annie and Ryan had been doing the long-distance thing. One weekend he would come and stay with her, and the next she would stay with him. Occasionally, they'd been able to fit in a week together. Annie had found a nursing job that interested her up by Ryan's new place, and as soon as the holidays were over, she was going to move in with him. Annie went back into the kitchen to check on their dinner, and when she came out, he was slipping a few presents under the tree. About 20 more minutes until dinner, just enough time to open presents. She grinned and touched the diamond heart pendant she wore, the one that had been stolen in Las Vegas and then thankfully recovered. Turning, Ryan handed her a long and narrow box, the kind that posters came in.
"This one first."
Suspecting it was some kind of art for his apartment, Annie carefully unwrapped it. Inside the box was a thick roll of multiple pieces of paper held together by a ribbon. As soon as they were unrolled, she knew what he'd brought her. House plans. For a 2-story home with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. The kitchen was huge, with a big island and breakfast nook. In the master bathroom, there was a huge jacuzzi tub. And next to the master bedroom was a room with floor-to-ceiling windows labeled Annie's studio. Ryan pointed at it.
"You always said you wanted one so you could learn how to paint and do arts and crafts."
The plans blurred as Annie's eyes filled with tears. "Our house," she whispered.
Yes, but you can change anything you want. I just wanted to get the ball rolling. Surprise you. If you don't like..."
Annie threw herself into his arms, sobbing. "It's perfect, just like you are."
"Oh, baby,"
he murmured as he held her, rubbing her heaving back.
"Shh, it's okay."
She pulled back fiercely. "It's better than okay. You're making all my dreams come true. And sometimes I wonder, what if we'd never figured things out? What if we'd missed out on all this, you and me?"
"That was never going to happen,"
he said firmly.
"But never, Annie. Between the 2 of us, we'd have made sure we became who we were meant to. I'd have worn you down, no matter how many games of strip poker I had to deal."
She laughed shakily. "How did I get so lucky?" He shrugged and said,
"I bet half the women in the city would like to know that."
She slugged him in the arm and he laughed. Then his expression turned serious.
"I'm the lucky one,"
he said. And then suddenly he was sliding off the couch onto one knee. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another box. This one was tiny and velvet. He popped open the lid, and inside was the most beautiful princess-cut diamond and sapphire ring that Annie had ever seen.
"Will you marry me, Annie?"
he asked. Annie put her hands on the sides of his face and forced herself not to say yes, not yet. "Don't you want to live together first, make sure we're compatible?"
"I've been waiting since Vegas to do this, and only because you were worried about taking things slow."
He grinned.
"I've known you for 9 years, Annie. There's no doubt in my mind you're the woman for me, and I'm the man for you. I want to spend the rest of our lives together, and the sooner you become my wife, the better. Now say you'll marry me, please."
Warmth radiated through her body, and she was smiling so widely her cheeks actually hurt. "You are all I've ever wanted, Ryan. Yes, I'll marry you." With a grin, he turned the ring over so she could see what was inscribed inside the band. It was their initials, designed to match her tattoo. And his. He'd had the intertwined initials inked on his shoulder. He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her until they were both breathless.
"Thank you for being brave enough to make your naughty list. Now, we should create and fulfill another one. Together."
"A new adventure?" She gazed down at the sparkling ring on her finger. "With you, Ryan Hennessy? I'm up for anything." The end. Written by Virna DePaul. Narrated by Ellen Lang. Copyright 2014 by Virna DePaul. Production copyright 2017 by Virna DePaul. Chapter 4. Wait, what had Ryan just said? Annie's chest tightened up on her, and suddenly she found it difficult to breathe. He was joking, right? He couldn't be serious. "Now you're just messing with me, Ryan, and I don't appreciate it." She more than didn't appreciate it. She started to get angry. How dare he play games about something that was so important to her? Was the idea of her being a bad girl that ridiculous to him?
"I'm completely serious, Annie."
"Sure you are," she scoffed. "This is exactly why I didn't tell you about my list. I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. You just need to accept that I've given this a lot of thought."
"Really? Because the Annie I know would never do that."
"You don't know everything about me," she said.
"Maybe you don't know how dangerous the things on your list can be,"
he said with genuine concern in his voice.
"Have you thought about that, Annie?"
"I trust my judgment," she said, even though her belly had nodded. "I'm willing to take the risks. I need to take risks."
"Maybe you should have told me that sooner," he shot back. "Because, like I said, I'm willing to help out, especially because keeping you safe is the most important thing in the world to me."
Her head was reeling. Ryan was serious. "What are you suggesting, exactly?" she asked.
"You and I are best friends, right? I'll pretend to be your fantasy dude. You do have a fantasy dude, right?"
Wow. Her heart pounded wildly. She had to act calm, cool. "Of course I do."
"Tell me his name."
"What?"
"His name. Who is it?"
"Let's just call him Kyle."
"Fine, I'll pretend to be Kyle. Just imagine it's Kyle whose voice is on the other end of the line."
"Ryan," she paused, not knowing what to say. The line was silent for several seconds.
"What are you wearing, Annie?"
he asked, a low timbre entering his voice. Annie flushed. Her whole body tingled. "I'm not sure I can do this with you."
"It's not me you're talking to. It's not me you're fantasizing about. Now close your eyes and see me. See Kyle. Tell Kyle what you're wearing."
She swallowed hard, gripped the phone harder. Her face was burning up and the heat was traveling down her neck into her chest. But she wanted more. What if he did too? What if the reason he didn't want her to go to Vegas was because the thought of her being with another man made him jealous? She struggled with her own cowardice. The silence on the other end of the line was palpable. Seconds ticked by, and with each one Annie felt the throb of humiliation in her veins, constricting her throat and mind.
"Annie,"
he finally began, his voice way too hesitant.
"Annie, babe."
She winced. "Never mind, I have to get up early tomorrow for my flight." A sudden and powerful wave of loneliness passed through her. Hurt and anger quickly followed.
"Annie, you can't be serious. You're still planning on going to Vegas? Because I just don't understand."
"You don't need to understand." She tried her best to keep her voice light. "This is for me, about me. I need to prove something to myself. I need to be adventurous for a change, and there isn't anything you or anyone else can do to stop me."
"But
I'm going to go to sleep now. Have a good night, and I'll talk to you later, okay?"
"Annie."
"Good night, Ryan," she said, then disconnected the call before he could hear the sobs that suddenly tore through her.